Daemonologie, by King of England James, I full audiobook created for Quiet Place Archive. Enjoy the listening. The fearful aboundage at this time in this country of these detestable slaws of the duel, the witches or enchanters, hath moved me, beloved reader, to dispatch in post this following treatise of mine, not in any wise, as I protest, to sorrow for a show of my learning and ingin, but onely muyed of conscience to prease thereby, so far as I can, to resolue the doubting hearts of many. Both that such assaults of Sathan are most certainly practised, and that the instruments thereof merits most severely to be punished, against the damnable opinions of two principally in our age, whereof the one called Scot, an Englishman, is not ashamed in public print to deny that there can be such a thing as witchcraft, and so maintains the old error of the Sadducees in denying of spirits. The other called Vvirvs, a German physician, sets out a public apology for all these craftsfolks, whereby, procuring for their impunity, he plainly bewrays himself to ha been one of that profession. And for to make this treatise the more pleasant and facile, I ha put it in form of a dialogue, which I ha divided into 3 books, the first speaking of magie in general and necromancy in special, the second of sorcery and witchcraft, and the third contains a discourse of all these kinds of spirits and spectres that appears and troubles persons, together with a conclusion of the whole work. My intention in this labor is only to prow 2 things, as I ha already said. The one, that such deulish arts ha been and are. The other, what exact trial and sewer punishment they merit. And therefore reason I, what kind of things are possible to be performed in these arts, and by what natural causes they may be. Not that I touch every particular thing of the duel's power, for that were infinite, but only, to speak scholastically, since this cannot be spoken in our language, I reason vipon genus lowing species, and differentia to be comprehended therein. As for example, speaking of the power of magicians, in the 1st book and 6th chapter, I say that they can suddenly cause be brought vnto them, all kinds of dainty dishes, by their familiar spirit. Since as a thief he delights to steal, and as a spirit he can subtly and suddenly transport the same. Now viender this genus may be comprehended all particulars, depending thereupon, such as the bringing wine out of a wall, as we ha heard off to ha been practiced, and such others, which particulars are sufficiently proved by the reasons of the general, and such like in the 2nd book of Witchcraft in special, and 5th chap. I say and prow by deus arguments, that witches can, by the power of their master, cure or cast on deceases. Now by these same reasons, that prows their power by the duel of deceases in generally, is a swell proud their power in special. As of weakening the nature of some men, to make them venable for women, and making it to abound in others, more than the ordinary course of nature would permit. And such like in all other particular sicknesses. But one thing I will pray thee to observe in all these places, where I reason upon the duel's power, which is the different ends and scopes, that God is the first cause, and the devil as his instrument and second cause shoots at in all these actions of the duel, as God's hangman. For where the duel's intention in them is you are to perish, either the soul or the body, or both of them, that he is so permitted to deal with. God, by the contrary, draws ewer out of that ewel glory to himself, either by the racky of the wicked in his justice, or by the trial of the patient and amendment of the faithful, being wakened VP with that rod of correction. Having thus declared vnto thee then, my full intention in this treatise, thou wilt easily excuse, I doubt not, a swell my pretermitting, to declare the whole particular rights and secrets of these vn lawful arts, as also their infinite and wonderful practices, as being neither of them pertinent to my purpose. The reason whereof is genuine in the hinder end of the 1st chapter of the 3rd book. And who likes to be curious in these things, he may read, if he will hear of their practices, bodinvs Daemonologie, collected with greater diligence, then written with judgment, together with their confessions, that ha been at this time apprehend. If he would know what hath been the opinion of the ancients concerning their power, he shall see it well described by Hyperivs and Hemmingivs, 2 late German writers, besides innumerable other Neoteric theologues that writes largely upon that subject. And if he would know what are the particular rites and curiosities of these black arts, which is both VN necessary and perilous, he will find it in the 4th book of Cornelius Agrippa, and in VVIRVS, whomof I spak. And so wishing my pains in this treatise, beloud reader, to be effectual, in arming all them that reads the same, against these above-mentioned errors, and recommending my good will to thy friendly acceptation, I bid thee heartily farewell. IEMES RX. PHILOMETHES, and EPISTMON reason the matter. PHILOMETHES. I am surely very glad to ha met with you this day, for I am of opinion that ye can better resolue me of something, whereof I stand in great doubt, nor any other whomwith I could ha met. EPI. In what I can, that ye like to spare at me, I will willingly and freely tell my opinion, and if I prow it not sufficiently, I am heartily content that a better reason carry it away then. Fie, what think ye of these strange news, which now onely furnishes purpose to all men at their meeting? I mean of these witches. EPI. Surely they are wonderful, and I think so clear and plain confessions in that purpose, ha newer fallen out in any age or country. Fie, no question if they be true, but thereof the doctor's doubts. EPI. What part of it doubt ye of? Fie, even of all, for aught I can yet perso, and namely, that there is such a thing as witchcraft or witches, and I would pray you to resolue me thereof if ye may. For I ha reasoned with sundry in that matter, and yet could never be satisfied therein. EPI. I shall with good will do the best I can, but I think it the difficiler, since ye deny the thing itself in general, for as it is said in the logic schools, contra negantum principia non est disputandum. Always for that part, that witchcraft and witches ha bene, and are, the former part is clearly proved by the scriptures, and the last by daily experience and confessions. Fie, I know ye will allege me Saul's Pythoness, but that as appears will not make much for you. EPI. Not only that place, but divers others, but I marvel why that should not make much for me. Fie, the reasons are these. First ye may consider, that Saul being troubled in spirit, and having fasted long before, as the text testifieth, and being come to a woman that was brooded to have such knowledge, and that to inquire so important news, he having so guilty a conscience for his heinous offenses, and specially for that same VN lawful curiosity and horrible defection. And then the woman crying out upon the sudden in great admiration, for the VN couth sick that she alleged to ha saying, discovering him to be the king, thog disguised, and denied by him before. It was no wonder, I say, that his senses being thus distracted, he could not perso hear feigning of hear voice, he being himself in another chalmer and seeing nothing. Next what could be or was raised, the spirit of Samuel, profane and against all theology, the deal in his lichens. As veen apparent, that either God would permit him to come in the shape of his saints, for then could newer the prophets in those days ha been sure, what spirit spake to them in their visions, or then that he could foretell what was to come thereafter, for prophecy proceedeth only of God, and the devil hath no knowledge of things to come. EPI. Yet if ye will mark the words of the text, ye will find clearly that Saul saw that apparition. For giving you that Saul was in another chalmer, at the making of the circles and conjurations, needful for that purpose, as none of that craft will permit any veithers to behold at that time. Yet it is evident by the text, that how sown that once that unclean spirit was fully risen, she called in upon Saul. For it is said in the text, that Saul knew him to be Samuel, which coulda not ha been, by the hearing tell only of an oldie man with an mantle, since there was many mo old men dead in Israel nor Samuel, and the common weight of that whole country was mantles. As to the next, that it was not the spirit of Samuel, I grant, in the proving whereof ye need not to insist, since all Christians of whatsoever religion agrees upon that, and none but either mere ignorance, or necromanciers or witches doubts thereof, and that the deil is permitted at some times to put himself in the likeness of the saints. It is plain in the scriptures, where it is said, that Satan can transform himself into an angel of light. Neither could that bring any inconvenient with the visions of the prophets, since it is most certain that God will not permit him so to deceive his own, but only such as first willfully deceives themselves, by running VNTO him, whom God then suffers to fall in their own snares, and justly permits them to be eluded with great efficacy of deceit, because they would not believe the truth, as Paul saith. And as to the Deul's foretelling of things to come, it is true that he knows not all things future, but yet that he knows part. The tragical event of this history declares it, which the wit of woman could never ha forspoken, not that he hath any prescience, which is only proper to God. Or yet knows anything by looking vpon God, as in a mirror, as the good angels do, he being for ewer debarred from the forrible presence and countenance of his Creator, but only by one of these two means, either as being worldly wise, and taught by an continual experience, ever since the creation, judges by likelihood of things to come, according to the like that hath passed before, and the natural causes, in respect of the vicissitude of all things worldly. Or else by God's employing of him in a turn, and so foreseen thereof, as appears to ha been in this, whereof we find the veri like in Michia's prophetic discourse to King Achab. But to prove you this my first proposition, that there can be such a thing as witchcraft, and witches, there are many mo places in the scriptures than this, as I said before. As first in the law of God, it is plainly prohibited, but certain it is, that the law of God speaks nothing in vain, neither doth it lay curses, or enjoin punishments vpon shadows, condemning that to be ill, which is not an essence or being as we call it. Secondly, it is plain, where wicked Pharaoh's wise men imitated a number of Moses' miracles, to harden the tyrant's heart thereby. Thirdly, said not Samuel to Saul, that disobedience is as the sin of witchcraft. To compare to a thing that were not, it were too absurd. Fourthly, was not Simon Magus a man of that craft? And fifthly, what was she that had the spirit of Python, beside innumerable other places that were irksome to recite? Philometichias. BVT, I think it very strange, that God should permit any mankind, since they bear his own image, to fall in so gross and filthy a defection. EPI. Although man in his creation was made to the image of the Creator, yet through his fall having once lost it, it is but restored again in a part by grace only to the elect. So all the rest falling away from God are given over in the hands of the devil, that enemy, to bear his image. And being once so given over, the greatest and the grossest impiety is the pleasantest and most delightful vnto them. Phi, but may it not suffice him to ha indirectly the rule, and procure the perdition of so many souls by alluring them to vices, and to the following of their own appetites, suppose he abuse not so many simple souls, in making them directly acknowledge him for their master. EPI. No, surely, for he says every man, whom if he hath the rule, according to their complexion and knowledge, and so whom he finds most simple, he plainliest discovers himself vnto them. For he being the enemy of man's salvation, says all the means he can to entrap them so far in his snares, as it may be venable to them thereafter, suppose they would, to rid themselves out of the same. Phi, then this sin is a sin against the Holy Ghost. EPI, it is in some but not in all. Phi, how that? Are not all these that runs directly to the devil in one category? EPI, God forbid, for the sin against the Holy Ghost hath two branches, the one a falling baccy from the whole service of God, and a refusal of all his precepts. The other is the doing of the first with knowledge, knowing that they do wrong against their own conscience, and the testimony of the Holy Spirit, having once had a taste of the sweetness of God's mercies. Now in the first of these two, all sorties of necromancers, enchanters, or witches are comprehended, but in the last, none but such as errs with this knowledge that I ha spoken of. Phi, then it appears that there are more sorties nor one, that are directly professors of his service, and if so be, I pray you tell me how many, and what are they? EPI, there are principally two sorties, wherevento all the parts of that happy art are redacted, whereof the one is called magi or necromancy, the other sorcery or witchcraft. Phi, what I pray you, and how many are the means, whereby the devil allures persons in any of these snares? EPI, even by these three passions that are within ourselves, curiosity and great engines, thirst of revenge for some torts deeply apprehended, or greedy appetite of gear caused through great poverty. As to the first of these, curiosity, it is only the enticement of magicians or necromanciers, and the other two are the allurers of the sorcerers, or witches, for that oldie and crafty serpent, being a spirit, he easily spies our affections, and so conforms himself thereto, to disso versus to our raki. Philometiges. I would gladly first hear, what thing is it that ye call magi or necromancy? Epi. This word magi in the Persian tongue imports as much as to be ain contemplator or interpreter of divine and heavenly sciences, which being first said amongst the Chaldees, through their ignorance of the true divinity, was esteemed and reputed amongst them as a principal virtue, and therefore was named vn justly with an honorable style, which name the Greeks imitated, generally importing all these kinds of vn lawful arts. And this word necromancy is a Greek word, compounded of nu epsilon kappa rho omega nu and mu alpha nu tau epsilon iota alpha, which is to say, the prophecy by the dead. This last name is given to this black and vn lawful science by the figure synodoch, because it is a principal part of that art, to seru themselves with dead carcages in their deuinations. Phi, what difference is there betwixt this art and witchcraft? Epi. Surely the difference vulgar put betwixt them is very merry and in a manner true, for they say that the witches are servants onely and slaws to the devil, but the necromanciers are his maesters and commanders. Phi, how can that be true, it any men being specially addicted to his service, can be his commanders? Epi. Yea, they may be, but it is only secundum quid, for it is not by any power that they can haw over him, but ex pacto alienarly, whereby he obliges himself in some trifles to them, that he may on the other part obtain the fruition of their body and soul, which is the only thing he hunts for. Phi, and veri inequitable contract forsooth, but I pray you discourse vnto me, what is the effect and secrets of that art? Epi. That is over large and fieldy ye giu me, yet I shall do good, will, the most summarily that I can, to run through the principal points thereof. As there are two sorts of folks that may be enticed to this art, to wit, learned or vn learned. So is there two means, which are the first steerers vp and feeders of their curiosity, thereby to make them to giu themselves over to the same, which two means I call the divil's school and his rudiments. The learned haw their curiosity wakened vppe, and fed by that which I call his school. This is the astrology judicer. For divers men having attained to a great perfection in learning, and yet remaining overbear, alas, of the spirit of regeneration and fruits thereof, finding all natural things common, a swell to the stupid pedants as vnto them, they essaya to vindicate vnto them a greater name, by not only knowing the course of things heavenly, but likewise to cling to the knowledge of things to come thereby, which, at the first face appearing lawful vnto them, in respect the ground thereof seemeth to proceed of natural causes only. They are so allured thereby, that finding their practice to prove you true in sundry things, they study to know the cause thereof, and so mounting from degree to degree, vpon the slippery and vn certain scale of curiosity, they are at last enticed, that where lawful arts or sciences fails, to satisfy their wrestles minds, even to seek to that black and vn lawful science of magi. Where, finding at the first, that such dewers forms of circles and conjurations rightly joined thereunto, will raise such divers forms of spirits, to resolve them of their doubts, and attributing the doing thereof, to the power inseparably tied, or inherent in the circles, and many words of God confusedly wrapped in, they blindly glory of themselves, as if they had by their quickness of engine made a conquest of Pluto's dominion, and were become emperors over the Stygian habiticles. Where, in the meantime, miserable wretches they are become in veri deed, bondslaws to their mortal enemy, and their knowledge for all that they presume thereof is nothing increased, except in knowing evil, and the horrors of hell for punishment thereof, as Adam's was by the eating of the forbidden tree. Philometiges. BVT, I pray you likewise forget not to tell what are the jewel's rudiments. Epi, his rudiments I call first in general, all that which is called vulgarly the virtue of word, herb, and stone, which is v said by vn lawful charms without natural causes, as likewise all kind of practics, freights, or other like extraordinary actions, which cannot abide the true touch of natural reason. Phi, I would haw you to make that plainer, by some particular examples, for your proposition is very general. EPI. I mean either by such kind of charms as commonly daft we use v says, for healing of forspoken goods, for pursuing them from Yule eyes, by knitting round trees, or sundriest kind of herbs, to the hair or tails of the goods, by curring the worm, by stemming of blood, by healing of horse crooks, by turning of the riddle, or doing of such like innumerable things by words, without applying anything, meet to the part offended, as mediciners do. Or else by staying married folks, to haw naturally a doe with other, by knitting so many knots vpon a point at the time of their marriage, and such like things, which men v says to practice in their merriness. For fra vn learned men, being naturally curious, and lacking the true knowledge of God, finds these practices to prove you true, as sundry of them will do, by the power of the devil for dissowing men, and not by any inherent virtue in these vain words and freights. And being desirous to win a reputation to themselves in such like turns, they either, if they be of the shamefaster sort, seek to be learned by some that are experimented in that art, not knowing it to be Yule at the first, or else being of the grosser sort, runs directly to the duel for ambition or desire of gain, and plainly contracts with him thereupon. Phi, but methinks these means which ye call the school and rudiments of the duel are things lawful, and ha beni approved for such in all times and ages. As in special, this science of astrology, which is one of the special members of the mathematics. EPI. There are two things which the learned ha observed from the beginning in the science of the heavenly creatures, the planets, stars, and such like. The one is their course and ordinary motions, which for that cause is called astronomia, which word is a compound of mu omicron sigma and alpha sigma tau epsilon rho omega nu, that is to say, the law of the stars. And this art indeed is one of the members of the mathematics, and not only lawful, but most necessary and commendable. The other is called astrologia, being compounded of alpha sigma tau epsilon rho omega nu and lambda omicron gamma omicron sigma, which is to say, the word and preaching of the stars, which is divided in two parts. The first by knowing thereby the powers of simples and sicknesses, the course of the seasons and the weather, being ruled by their influence, which part depending vpon the former, although it be not of itself a part of mathematics. Yet it is not vn lawful, being moderately v said, suppose not so necessary and commendable as the former. The second part is to trust so much to their influences, as thereby to foretell what commonweals shall flourish or decay, what persons shall be fortunate or vn fortunate, what side shall win in any battle, what man shall obtain victory at singular combat, what way, and of what age shall men die, what horse shall win at match running, and dius such like incredible things, wherein Cardanus, Cornelius Agrippa, and dius others ha more curiously than profitably written at large. Of this root last spoken of, springs innumerable branches, such as the knowledge by the natiuities, the cheromancy, geomanty, hydromanty, arithmanty, physiognomy, and 1,000 others, which were much practiced and holden in great reverence by the gentles of oldie. And this last part of astrology whereof I ha spoken, which is the root of their branches, was called by them pars fortunae. This part now is vt turly vn lawful to be trusted in, or practised amongst Christians, as leaning to no ground of natural reason. And it is this part which I called before the duel's skoll. Phi, but yet many of the learned are of the contrary opinion. EPI. I grant, yet I could give you my reasons to fortify and maintain my opinion, if to enter into this disputation it wold not draw me quite off the ground of our discours. Besides the me's spending of the whole day thereupon, one word only I will answer it to them, and that in the scriptures, which must be an infallible ground to all true Christians, that in the prophet Jeremy it is plainly forbidden to believe or hearken vnto them that prophecies and forespeaks by the course of the planets and stars. Philometiges. Well, ye ha said far enough in that argument, but how prove ye now that these charms or vn natural practics are vn lawful? For so, Many honest and merry men and women ha publicly practise some of them, that I think if ye would accuse them all of witchcraft, ye would affirm more nor ye will be believed in. I see if you had taken good tent to the nature of that word whereby I named it, ye would not ha been in this doubt, nor mistaken me so far as ye ha done. For although, as none can be scholars in a school, and not be subject to the master thereof, so none can study and put in practise for study thee alone, and knowledge is more perilous nor offence you, and it is the practice only that makes the greatness of the offence. The circles and art of magi, without committing an horrible defection from God, and yet as they that reads and learns their rudiments are not the more subject to any schoolmaster, if it please not their parents to put them to the school thereafter. So they who ignorantly prowse these practics, which I call the duel's rudiments, vn knowing them to be baits, casten out by him, for trapping such as God will permit to fall in his hands. This kind of folks, I say, no doubt, are to be judged the best of, in respect they see no invocation nor help of him, by their knowledge at least in these turns, and so ha newer entered themselves in Sathan's Saruis. Yet to speak truly for my own part, I speak but for myself I desire not to make so near writing. For in my opinion our enemy is our crafty, and we our weak, except the greater grace of God to assay such hazards, wherein he preases to trap these. Ye ha reason forsooth, for as the common proverb saith, they that sepec hail with the duel ha need of long spoons. But now I pray you go forward in the describing of this art of magi. Fra they become once vnto this perfection in uil, in hawing any knowledge, whether learned or vn learned of this black art. They then begin to be wary of the raising of their maester, by conjured circles, being both so difficile and perilous, and so cometh plainly to a contract with him, wherein is specially contained forms and effects. But I pray you or you go further, discourse me somewhat of their circles and conjurations, and what should be the cause of their wearying thereof. For it should seem that that form should be less fearful yet than the direct haunting and society, with that foul and unclean spirit. I think ye take me to be a witch myself, or at the least would fain swear yourself prentice to that craft. Always as I may, I shall shortly satisfy you in that kind of conjurations, which are contained in such books which I call the duel's school. There are 4 principal parts: the persons of the conjurers, the action of the conjuration, the words and rites said to that effect, and the spirits that are conjured. Ye must first remember to lay the ground that I told you before, which is, that it is no power inherent in the circles, or in the hallings of the names of God blasphemously said, nor in whatsoever rites or ceremonies at that time said, that either can raise any infernal spirit, or yet limitat him perforce within or without these circles. For it is he only, the father of all lies, who hawing first of all prescribed that form of doing, feigning himself to be commanded and restrained thereby, will be loath to pass the bounds of these injunctions, a swell thereby to make them glory in the empiring hour him, as I said before, as likewise to make himself so to be trusted in these little things, that he may haw the better commodity thereafter, to deceive them in the end with a trick once for all. I mean the everlasting perdition of their soul and body. Then laying this ground, as I ha said, these conjurations must ha few or mo in number of the persons conjurers, always passing the singular number, according to the quality of the circle, and form of apparition. 2 principal things cannot well in that errand be wanted: holy water, whereby the duel mocks the papists, and some present of a leewing thing vnto him. There are likewise certain seasons, days, and hours that they observe in this purpose. These things being all ready and prepared, circles are made triangular, quadrangular, round, double, or single, according to the form of apparition that they craw. But to speak of the diuous forms of the circles, of the innumerable characters and crosses that are within and without, and out through the same, of the diuers' forms of apparitions, that crafty spirit eludes them with, and or all such particulars in that action, I remit it to our many that ha busied their heads in describing of the same, as being but curious, and altogether profitable. And this far only I touch, that when the conjured spirit appears, which will not be while after many circumstances, long prayers, and much muttering and murmuring of the conjurers, like a papist priest dispatching a hunting mass, How soon, I say, he appears if they ha missed one iota of all their rights, or if any of their feet once slide o'er the circle through terror of his fearful apparition, he pays himself at that time in his own hand of that due debt which they ought him. And otherwise would ha delayed longer to ha paid him. I mean he carries them with him body and soul. If this be not now a just cause to make them wary of these forms of conjuration, I low it to you to judge vipon, considering the longsomeness of the labor, the precise keeping of days and hours, as I ha said, the terribleness of apparition, and the present peril that they stand in missing the least circumstance or freight that they ought to observe. And on the other part, the duel is glad to move them to a plain and square dealing with him, as I said before. Philometiges. Indeed, there is cause in awe, but rather to low him at all, than to run more plainly to him, if they were wise he dealt with. But go forwards now, I pray you, to these turns, fra they become once deacons in this craft. Epi. From time that they once plainly begin to contract with him, the effect of their contract consists in two things, in forms and effects, as I began to tell already, were it not ye interrupted me, for although the contract be mutual. I speak first of that part, wherein the duel obliges himself to them, by forms, I mean in what shape or fashion he shall come viento them, when they call vipon him. And by effects, I understand, in what special sorts of services he binds himself to be subject viento them. The quality of these forms and effects is less or greater, according to the skill and art of the magician. For as to the forms, to some of the baser sort of them he obliges himself to appear at their calling vipon him, by such a proper name which he shows viento them, either in likens of a dog, a cat, an ape, or such like other beast, or else to answer by a voice only. The effects are to answer to such demands as concerns curring of deceases, their own particular menagerie, or such other base things as they require of him. But to the most curious sort, in the forms he will oblige himself, to enter in a dead body, and there out of to giu such answers, of the ewan of battles, of matters concerning the estate of commonwealths, and such like other great questions. Yea, to some he will be a continual attenders, in form of a page. He will permit himself to be conjured, for the space of so many years, either in a tablet or a ring, or such like thing, which they may easily carry about with them. He gives them power to sell such wares to others, whereof some will be dearer and some better cheap, according to the lying or true speaking of the spirit that is conjured therein. Not but that in veri deed all devils must be liars, but so they abuse the simplicity of these wretches, that becomes their scholars that they make them believe that at the fall of Lucifer some spirits fell in the air, some in the fire, some in the water, some in the land, in which elements they still remain. Whereupon they build, that such as fell in the fire or in the air are truer than they who fell in the water or in the land, which is all but mere trattles, and forged by the author of all deceit. For they fell not be weight as a solid substance to stick in any one part, but the principal part of their fall, consisting in quality, by the falling from the grace of God wherein they were created, they continued still thereafter, and shall do while the latter day, in wandering through the world as God's hangmen, to execute such turns as he employs them in. And when any of them are not occupied in that, return they must to their prison in hell, as it is plain in the miracle that Christ wrought at Genezareth, therein at the latter day to be all enclosed for ewer. And as they deceive their scholars in this, so do they, in imprinting in them the opinion that there are so many princes, dukes, and kings amongst them, ewery one commanding fewer or mo legions, and impering in dewers arts and quarters of the earth. For though that I will not deny that there be a form of order amongst the angels in Hoen, and consequently was amongst them before their fall, yet either that they break the same sensine, or that God will permit these to know by damned duels such hoenly mysteries of his, which he would not rule to these neither by scripture nor prophets, I think no Christian will once think it. But by the contrary of all such mysteries, as he hath closed VP with his seal of secrecy, it becometh these to be contented with an humble ignorance, they being things not necessary for our saluation. But to return to the purpose, as these forms, wherein Sathan obliges himself to the greatest of the magicians, are wonderful curious, so are the effects correspondent viento the same. For he will oblish himself to teach them arts and sciences, which he may easily do, being so learned enow as he is. To carry them news from any part of the world, which the agility of a spirit may easily perform. To rule to them the secrets of any persons, so being they be once spoken, for the thought none knows but God, except so far as ye may guess by their countenance, as one who is doubtlessly learned in the physiognomy. Yea, he will make his scholars to creep in credit with princes by foretelling them many great things, part true, part false. For if all were false, he would tine credit at all hands, but always doubtsome as his oracles were. And he will also make them to please princes, by fair banquets and dainty dishes, carried in short space fra the farthest part of the world. For no man doubts but he is a thief, and his agility, as I spake before, makes him to come such speed. Such like he will guard his scholars with fair armies of horsemen and footmen in appearance, castles and fortes, which all are but impressions in the air, easily gathered by a spirit, drawing so near to that substance himself. As in like manner he will learn them many jugglery tricks at guards, dice, and such like, to deceive men's senses thereby, and such innumerable false practics, which are prowen by our many in this age. As they who are acquainted with that Italian called Scoto yet liuing, can report. And yet are all these things but deluding of the senses, and no ways true in substance, as were the false miracles wrought by King Pharaoh's magicians, for counterfeiting moises. For that is the difference betwixt God's miracles and the jewels. God is a creator, what he makes appear in miracle, it is so in effect. As Moises' rod being cast down, was no doubt turned in a natural serpent, whereas the jewel as God's ape, counterfeiting that by his magicians, made their wands to appear so, onely to men's outward senses, as kith in effect by their being jeweled by the other. For it is no wonder that the jewel may delude our senses, since we see by common proof that simple jugglers will make 100 things seem both to our eyes and ears otherways than they are. Now as to the magician's part of the contract, it is in a word that thing, which I said before, the jewel hunts for in all men. Fie, surely ye ha said much to me in this art, if all that ye ha said be as true as wonderful. EPI, for the truth in these actions, it will be easily confirmed, to any that pleases to take pain vpon the reading of Deus authentic histories, and the inquiring of daily experiences. And as for the truth of their possibility, that they may be, and in what manner, I trust I ha alleged nothing whereunt, I ha not ein such probable reasons as I low to your discretion to weigh and consider. One word only I omitted, concerning the form of making of this contract, which is either written with the magician's own bloud, or else being agreed vpon, in terms his schoolmaster touches him in some part, though peradventure no mark remain, as it doth with all witches. Philometiges. Esfreli, ye ha made this art to appear very monstrous and detestable. But what I pray you shall be said to such as maintains this art to be lawful, for as you will as you ha made it. EPI. I say, they soar of the pan themselves, or at least little better, and yet I would be glad to hear their reasons. Fie, there are two principally that ewer I heard v said, beside that which is founded vpon the common proverb, that the necromancers commands the jewel, which ye ha already refuted. The one is grounded vpon a received custom, the other vpon an authority, which some thinks infallible. Vpon custom, we see that Deus Christian princes and magistrates sewer punishers of witches, will not only our see magicians to liu within their dominions, but ewen sometimes delight to see them prue you some of their practics. The other reason is, that Moises being brought VP, as it is expressly said in the scriptures, in all the sciences of the Egyptians, whereof no doubt this was one of the principals. And he notwithstanding of this art, pleasing God, as he did, consequently that art professed by so godly a man could not be unlawful. EPI. As to the first of your reasons, grounded vpon custom, I say an ewel custom can newer be accepted for a good law, for the our great ignorance of the word in some princes and magistrates, and the contempt thereof in others, moves them to sin heavily against their office in that point. As to the other reason, which seems to be of greater weight, if it were formed in a syllogism, it behooved to be in many terms, and full of fallacies, to speak in terms of logic for first, that general proposition, affirming Moises to be taught in all the sciences of the Egyptians, should conclude that he was taught in magi, I see no necessity. For we must understand that the Spirit of God there, speaking of sciences, understands them that are lawful. For except they be lawful, they are but a busy called sciences, and are but ignorances indeed. Nam homo pictus non est homo. Secondly, geoing that he had been taught in it, there is great difference betwixt knowledge and practicing of a thing, as I said before. For God knoweth all things, being always good, and of our sin and our infirmity proceedeth our ignorance. Thirdly, geoing that he had both studied and practiced the same, which is more nor monstrous to be believed by any Christian. Yet we know well enough that before that the Spirit of God began to call Moises, he was fled out of Egypt, being 40 years of age, for the slaughter of an Egyptian, and in his good father Iethro's land, first called at the fiery bush, hoeing remained there other 40 years in exile. So that suppose he had been the wickedest man in the world of before, he then became a changed and regenerate man, and very little of oldie Moises remained in him. Abraham was an idolater in VR of child Atildaea, before he was called, and Paul being called Saul was a most sharp persecutor of the saints of God, while that name was changed. Fie, what punishment then think ye merits these magicians and necromancers? EPI, the like no doubt that sorcerers and witches merits, and rather so much greater as their error proceeds of the greater knowledge, and so draws nearer to the sin against the Holy Ghost. And as I say of them, so say I the like of all such as consults, inquires, entertains, and oversees them, which is seen by the miserable ends of many that asks counsel of them. For the duel hath newer better tidings to tell to any, than he told to Saul. Neither is it lawful to vse so vien lawful instruments, were it newer for so good a purpose. For that axiom in theology is most certain and infallible. Nunquam faciendum est malum vt bonum indueniat. Piechilometichias. Now since ye ha satisfied me no so fully, concerning magi or necromancy, I will pray you to do the like in sorcery or witchcraft. EPI, that fielda is likewise very large, and all thought in the mouths and pennies of many, yet few knows the truth thereof, so well as they believe themselves, as I shall so shortly as I can, make you, God willing, as easily to perceive you. Fie, but I pray you before ye go further, let me interrupt you here with a short digression, which is, that many can scarcely believe that there is such a thing as witchcraft, whose reasons I will shortly allege vnto you, that ye may satisfy me as well in that, as ye ha done in the rest. For first, whereas the scripture seems to prove you witchcraft to be, by Deus examples, and specially by sundry of the same, which ye ha alleged, it is thought by some, that these places speaks of magicians and necromancers only, and not of witches. As in special, these wise men of Pharaoh's that counterfeited Moises' miracles were magicians, say they, and not witches. As likewise that Pythoness that Saul consulted with, and so was Simon Magus in the New Testament, as that very style imports. Secondly, where ye would open the daily practic, and confession of so many, that is thought likewise to be but very melancholic imaginations of simple rawing creatures. Thirdly, if witches had such power of witching of folks to death, as they say they ha, there had been none left aliu long since in the world, but they, at the least, no good or godly person of whatsoever estate, could ha escaped their duelry. EPI, your three reasons as I take, are grounded the first of them negative vpon the scripture, the second affirmative vpon physic, and the third vpon the certain proof of experience. As to your first, it is most true indeed that all these wise men of Pharaoh were magicians of art, as likewise it appears well that the Pythoness, with whom Saul consulted, was of that same profession, and so was Simon Magus. But ye omitted to speak of the law of God, wherein are all magicians, deuines, enchanters, sorcerers, witches, and whatsoever of that kind that consults with the duel, plainly prohibited and alike threatened against. And besides that, she who had the spirit of Python in the Acts, whose spirit was put to silence by the apostle, could it be no other thing but a very sorcerer or witch, if ye admit the vulgar distinction, to be in a manner true, whereof I spake in the beginning of our conference. For that spirit whereby she conquested such gain to her master, was not at her raising or commanding, as she pleased to appoint, but spake by her tongue, as well publicly as privately, whereby she seemed to draw nearer to the sort of demoniacs or possessed, if that conjunction betwixt them had not been of her own consent, as it appeared by her not being tormented therewith, and by her conquesting of such gain to her masters, as I ha already said. As to your second reason grounded vipon physic, in attributing their confessions or apprehensions to a natural melancholic humor, any that pleases physically to consider vipon the natural humor of melancholy, according to all the physicians, that you are writ thereupon, they shall find that that will be our short a cloak to cower their nowery with. For as the humor of melancholy in the self is blacky, hoey, and terrene, so are the symptoms thereof, in any persons that are subject thereunto, lians, palings, desire of solitude. And if they come to the highest degree thereof, mere folly and manie, whereas by the contrary, a great number of them that you are ha beni convict or confessors of witchcraft, as may be presently seen by many that ha at this time confessed. They are by the contrary, I say, some of them rich and worldly wise, some of them fat or corpulent in their bodies, and most part of them altogether due an hour to the pleasures of the flesh, continual haunting of company, and all kind of marrings, both lawful and unlawful, which are things directly contrary to the symptoms of melancholy, whereof I spake, and further experience daily prows how loath they are to confess without torture, which witnesseth their guiltines, whereby the contrary. The melancholics newer spares to bewray themselves, by their continual discourses, feeding thereby their humor in that which they think no crime. As to your third reason, it scarcely merits an answer. For if the duel their master were not bridled, as the scriptures teacheth viz., suppose there were no men nor women to be his instruments, he could find ways in without any help of others to rack all mankind. Wherefore he employs his whole study, and goeth about like a roaring lion, as Peter saith to that effect. But the limits of his power were set down before the foundations of the world were laid, which he hath not power in the least jot to transgress. But beside all this, there is our great certainty to prow that they are, by the daily experience of the harms that they do, both to men and whatsoever thing men possesses, whom God will permit them to be the instruments, so to trouble or visite, as in my discourse of that art, ye shall hear clearly proud. Philometiges. Come on then, I pray you, and return where ye left. Epi. This word of sorcery is a Latin word, which is taken from casting of the lot, and therefore he that viseth it is called sorciarius a sort. As to the word of witchcraft, it is nothing but a proper name genuine in our language. The cause wherefore they were called sorcerage proceeded of their practice seeming to come of lot or chance, such as the turning of the riddle, the knowing of the form of prayers or such like tokens, if a person diseased would a liu or die. And in general, that name was genuine in them for vising of such charms, and freights, as that craft teacheth them. Many points of their craft and practice are common betwixt the magicians and them, for they serve both one master, all thought in dius fashions. And as I divided the necromancers into two sorts, learned and unlearned, so must I deny them in other two, rich and of better accompt, poor and of baser degree. These two degrees now of persons, that practices this craft, answers to the passions in them, which I told you before the duel said as means to entice them to his service. For such of them as are in great misery and poverty, he allures to follow him, by promising vnto them great riches and worldly commodity. Such as though rich, yet burns in a desperate desire of revenge, he allures them by promises, to get their turn satisfied to their heart's contentment. It is to be noted, that oldie and crafty enemy of ours assails none, though touched with any of these two extremities, except he first find an interest ready for him, either by the great ignorance of the person he deals with, armed with an Ewell life, or else by their carelessness and contempt of God. And finding them in inviter despair, for one of these two former causes that I ha spoken of, he prepares the way by feeding them craftily in their humor, and filling them further and further with despair, while he find the time proper to discour himself vnto them. At which time, either vipon their walking solitary in the fields, or else lying pansing in their bed, but always without the company of any other, he either by a voice, or in likeness of a man inquires of them what troubles them, and promiseth them, a sudden and certain way of remedy vipon condition on the other part, that they follow his advice, and do such things as he will require of them. Their minds being prepared beforehand, as I ha already spoken, they easily agreed vnto that demand of his, and signs sets an other triest, where they may meet again. At which time, before he proceed any further with them, he first persuades them to addict themselves to his service, which being easily obtained, he then discowers what he is vnto them, makes them to renounce their God and baptism directly, and use them his mark vipon some secrete place of their body, which remains sore vn healed, while his next meeting with them, and thereafter you are insensible, howso you are it be nipped or pricked by any, as is daily proud, to gu them a proof thereby, that as in that doing he could hurt and heal them, so all their ill and well-doing thereafter must depend vipon him. And besides that, the intolerable dolor that they feel in that place, where he hath marked them, serus to waken them and not to let them rest, while their next meeting again, fearing least other ways they might either forget him, being as new prentices and not well enough founded yet in that fiendly folly, or else remembering of that horrible promise they made him, at their last meeting they might scunner at the same and preasse to call it back. At their third meeting, he makes a show to be careful to perform his promises, either by teaching them ways how to get themselves revenged, if they be of that sort, or else by teaching them lessons, how by most vilda and vn lawful means they may obtain gain and worldly commodity if they be of the other sort. Philometigs. Yeha said now in awe of their initiating in that order. It rests then that ye discourse vipon their practices, fra they be past prentices, for I would fain hear what is possible to them to perform in veri deed. Although they seru a common master with the necromancers, as I ha before said, yet seru they him in an other form. For as the means are dius, which allures them to these vn lawful arts of seruing of the duel, so by dius ways vsc they their practices, answering to these means, which first the duel, v said as instruments in them, though all tending to one end, to wit, the enlarging of Sathan's tyranny and crossing of the propagation of the kingdom of Christ, so far as lieth in the possibility, either of the one or other sort, or of the duel their master. For where the magicians, as allured by curiosity in the most part of their practices, seeks principally the satisfying of the same, and to win to themselves a popular honor and estimation. These witches on the other part, being enticed either for the desire of revenge, or of worldly riches, their whole practices are either to hurt men and their gudes, or what they possess, for satisfying of their cruel minds in the former, or else by the racky and whatsoever sort, of any whom God will permit them to ha power off, to satisfy their greedy desire in the last point. EPI. In two parts their actions may be divided, the actions of their own persons, and the actions proceeding from them towards any other. And this division being well understood, will easily resolve you what is possible to them to do. For although all that they confess is no lie vipon their part, yet doubtlessly in my opinion, a part of it is not indeed, according as they take it to be. And in this I mean by the actions of their own persons. For as I said before, speaking of magi that the duel eludes the senses of these scholars of his, in many things, so say I the like of these witches. Phi, then I pray you, first to speak of that part of their own persons, and sign ye may come next to their actions towards others. EPI, to the effect that they may perform such services of their false master, as he employs them in, the duel as God's ape, counterfeits in his seruantes this service and form of adoration, that God prescribed and made his seruantes to practice. For as the seruants of God, publicly v says to convene for seruing of him, so makes he them in great numbers to convene, though publicly they dare not for his seruis. As none canoeings to the adoration and worshipping of God, except they be marked with his scale, the sacrament of baptismy, so none serus Sathan, and canoeings to the adoring of him, that are not marked with that mark, whereof I already spake. As the minister sent by God, teacheth plainly at the time of their public connuncians, how to seru him in spirit and truth, so that vn clean spirit in his own person teacheth his disciples, at the time of their canoeing, how to work all kind of mischief, and craws compt of all their horrible and detestable proceedings past, for adouncement of his Cerois. Yea, that he may the more vilely counterfeit and scorn God, he oft times makes his slaws to convene in these very places, which are destinate and ordained for the convening of the servants of God, I mean by churches. But this far, which I ha yet said, I not only take it to be true in their opinions, but you and so to be indeed. For the form that he said in counterfeiting God amongst the Gentiles makes me so to think. As God spake by his oracles, spake he not so by his. As God had a swell blowdy sacrifices, as others without blowed had not he the like. As God had churches sanctified to his Cerois, with altars, priests, sacrifices, ceremonies, and prayers, had he not the like polluted to his Cerois? As God gaw responses by Vrim and Thummim, gaw he not his responses by the intrals of beasts, by the singing of fowls, and by their actions in the air? As God by visions, dreams, and ecstases ruled what was to come, and what was his will VNTO his Ceroantes. Said he not the like means to forewarn his slaws of things to come. Yea, Ewan as God loud cleans, hated vice and impurity, and appointed punishments therefore. Said he not the like, though falsely I grant, and but in eschewing the less inconvenient, to draw them upon a greater, yet dissimuled he not I say, so far as to appoint his priests to keep their bodies clean and undefiled, before their asking responses of him. And feigned he not God to be a protector of ewery virtue, and a east ruinger of the contrary. This reason then moves me, that as he is that same duel, and as crafty know as he was then, so will he not spare a pertelly in these actions that I ha spoken of, concerning the witches' persons. But further, witches oft times confesses not only his canoeing in the church with them, but his occupying of the pulpit, yea, their form of adoration to be the kissing of his hinder parts. Which though it seem ridiculous, yet may it likewise be true, seeing we read that in Calicute, he appearing in form of a goat buck, hath publicly that honest homage done VNTO him, by Uri one of the people. So ambitious is he, and greedy of honor, which procured his fall that he will Ewan imitate God in that part, where it is said, that Moises could see but the hinder parts of God, for the brightness of his glory. And yet that speech is spoken, but alpha nu theta megapi alpha theta epsilon iota alpha nu. Philomate EGS. BVT, by what way say they, or think ye it possible that they can come to these VN lawful coentios? EPI, there is the thing which I esteem their senses to be deluded in, and though they lie not in confessing of it, because they think it to be true, yet not to be so in substance or effect. For they say that by Deus means they may canoeing, either to the adoring of their master, or to the putting in practice any Cerois of his, committed VNTO their charge. One way is natural, which is natural riding, going or sailing, at what hour their master comes and advertises them. And this way may be easily belued. Another way is somewhat more strange, and yet is it possible to be true, which is by being carried by the force of the spirit which is their conductor, either about the earth or about the sea swiftly, to the place where they are to meet, which I am persuaded to be likewise possible, in respect that as Habakkuk was carried by the angel in that form to the den where Daniel lay. So think I, the duel will be ready to imitate God, as well in that as in other things. Which is much more possible to him to do, being a spirit, than to a mighty wind, being but a natural meteor, to transport from one place to another a solid body, as is commonly and daily seen in practice. But in this violent form they cannot be carried, but a short bounds, agreeing with the space that they may retain their breath. For if it were longer, their breath could not remain extinguished, their body being carried in such a violent and forcible manner, as be example. If one fall off in small height, his life is but in peril, according to the hard or soft lighting. But if one fall from an high and stay rock, his breath will be forcibly banished from the body, before he can win to the earth, as is oft seen by experience. And in this transporting they say themselves, that they are inusable to any other, except amongst themselves, which may also be possible in my opinion. For if the duel may form what kind of impressions he pleases in the air, as I ha said before, speaking of magi, why may he not far easilier thicken and obscure so the air, that is next about them by contracting it straight together, that the beams of any other man's eyes cannot pierce thorough the same to see them. But the third way of their coming to their connunctions is that wherein I think them deluded. For some of them saith, that being transformed in the likeness of a little beast or fowl, they will come and pierce through whatso your house or church, though all ordinary passages be closed, by whatso your open, the air may enter in at. And some saith, that their bodies lying still as in an ecstasy, their spirits will be raised out of their bodies, and carried to such places. And for verifying thereof, will giu uident tokens, a swell by witnesses that ha seen their body lying sensells in the meantime, as by naming persons, whom, with they met, and giuing tokens what purpose was amongst them, whom other ways they could not ha known. For this form of journeying they affirm to VSE most, when they are transported from one country to another. Fie, surely I long to hear your own opinion of this, for they are like old weus trattles about the fire. The reasons that moves me to think that these are mere illusions are these. First, for them that are transformed in likens of beasts or fowls, can enter through so narrow passages, although I may easily believe that the dual coulda by his workmanship vipon the air, make them appear to be in such forms, either to themselves or to others. Yet how he can contract a solid body within so little room, I think it is directly contrary to itself, for to be made so little, and yet not diminished, to be so straightly drawn together, and yet feel no pain. I think it is so contrary to the quality of a natural body, and so like to the little transubstantiate God in the Papists' Mass, that I can newer believe it. So to ha a quantity is so proper to a solid body, that as all philosophers conclude, it cannot be any more without one, than a spirit can ha one. For when Peter came out of the prison, and the doors all locked, it was not by any contracting of his body in so little room, but by the giuing place of the door, though vn espied by the gaolers. And yet is there no comparison, when this is done, betwixt the power of God and of the dual. As to their form of ecstasy and spiritual transporting, it is certain the soul's going out of the body is the only definition of natural death. And who are once dead, God forbid we should think that it should lie in the power of all the duals in hell to restore them to their life again, although he can put his own spirit in a dead body, which the necromancers commonly practice, as ye ha hard. For that is the office properly belonging to God, and besides that, the soul once parting from the body cannot wander any longer in the worlda, but to the own resting place must it go immediately, abiding the conjunction of the body again at the latter day. And what Christ or the prophets did miraculously in this case, it cannot in no Christian man's opinion be made common with the dual. As for any tokens that they giu for proving of this, it is very possible to the dual's craft to persuade them to these means. For he being a spirit, may he not so roish their thoughts, and dull their senses, that their body lying as dead, he may object to their spirits as it were in a dream. And as the poets write of Morpheus, represent such forms of persons, of places, and other circumstances, as he pleases to allude them with. Yea, that he may deceive them with the greater efficacy, may he not at that same instant, by fellow angels of his, elude such other persons so in that same fashion, whom with he makes them to believe that they met, that all their reports and tokens, though sewerally examined, may uery one agree with another. And that whatso your actions, either in hurting men or beasts, or whatso your other thing that they falsely imagine at that time to ha done, may by himself or his marrows at that same time be done indeed. So as if they would giu for a token of their being raised at the death of such a person within so short space thereafter, whom they believe to ha poisoned, or witched at that instante, might he not at that same hour ha smitten that same person by the permission of God, to the farther deceiving of them, and to move you others to believe them. And this is surely the likeliest way, and most according to reason, which my judgment can find out in this, and whatso your vither vn natural points of their confession. And by these means shall we sail surely betwixt Charybdis and Scylla, in eschewing the not believing of them altogether on the one part, least that draw vies to the error that there is no witches, and on the other part in believing of it, make versus to eschew the falling into innumerable absurdities, both monstrously against all theology divine and philosophy humane. Philometiges. Forsooth your opinion in this, seems to carry most reason with it, and since ye ha ended, then the actions belonging properly to their own persons. Say forward now to their actions, v said towards others. EPI. In their actions v said towards others, 3 things ought to be considered. First, the manner of their consulting thereupon, next their part as instruments, and last their master's part, who puts the same in execution. As to their consultations thereupon, they see them oftest in the churches, where they convene for adoring. At what time their master enquiring at them what they would be at. Usury one of them propones vnto him, what wicked turn they would ha done, either for obtaining of riches, or for ruinging them vpon Annie whom they ha malice at. Who granting their demand, as no doubt willingly he will, since it is to do Ewell, he teacheth them the means, whereby they may do the same. As for little trifling turns that women ha ado with, he causeth them to eat dead corpses, and to make powders thereof, mixing such other things there amongst, as he use vnto them. Fie, but before ye go further, permit me, I pray you, to interrupt you one word, which ye ha put me in memory of, by speaking of women. What can be the cause that there are 20 women into that craft, where there is one man? EPI. The reason is easy, for as that sex is frailer than man is, so is it easier to be entrapped in these gross snares of the duel, as was our well proud to be true, by the serpent's deceiving of you at the beginning, which makes him the homelier with that sex sensine. Fie, return now where ye left. EPI. To some others at these times he teacheth how to make pictures of wax or clay, that by the rosting thereof, the persons that they bear the name of may be continually melted or dried away by continual sickness. To some he use such stones or putters, as will help to cure or cast on diseases. And to some he teacheth kinds of viencuth poisons, which mediciners understands not, for he is far cunninger than man in the knowledge of all the occult proprieties of nature. Not that any of these means which he teacheth them, except the poisons which are composed of things natural, can of themselves help anything to these turns, that they are employed in, but only being God's ape, as well in that, as in all other things. Even as God by his sacraments which are earthly of themselves works a heavenly effect, though no ways by any cooperation in them. And as Christ by clay and spettle wrought together, opened the eyes of the blind man, suppose there was no virtue in that which he outwardly applied. So the duel will ha his outward means to be shows as it were of his doing, which hath no part of cooperation in his turns with him, how far that you or the ignorance be abused in the contrary. And as to the effects of these 2 former parts, to wit, the consultations and the outward means, they are so wonderful as I dare not allege any of them, without ironing a sufficient reason of the possibility thereof. For lowing all the small trifles among weus, and to speak of the principal points of their craft. For the common trifles thereof, they can do without conwerting well enough by themselves. These principal points, I say, are these. They can make men or women to low or hate other, which may be very possible to the duel to effectual, seeing he being a subtle spirit, knows well enough how to persuade the corrupted affection of them whom God will permit him so to deal with. They can lay the sickness of one vpon another, which likewise is very possible vnto him. For since by God's permission he laid sickness vpon iob, why may he not far easilier lay it vpon any other? For as an old practician, he knows well enough what humor domines most in any of v's, and as a spirit he can subtly walk in vp the same, making it peccant, or to abound, as he thinks meet for troubling of v's, when God will so permit him. And for the taking off of it, no doubt he will be glad to relieve you such of present pain, as he may think by these means to persuade to be catched in his everlasting snares and fetters. They can be witch and take the life of men or women, by rosting of the pictures, as I spake of before, which likewise is very possible to their master to perform, for although, as I said before, that instrument of wax ha no virtue in that turn-doing, yet may he not very well ewen by that same measure that his conjured slaws melts that wax at the fire, may he not, I say, at these same times, subtly as a spirit so weaken and scatter the spirits of life of the patient, as may make him on own part, for faintness to sweat out the humor of his body, and on the other part, for the not concurrence of these spirits, which causes his digestion, so debilitate his stomach, that his humor radical continually, sweating out on the one part, and no new good suck being put in the place thereof, for lack of digestion on the other, he at last shall vanish away, ewen as his picture will dough at the fire. And that noish and cunning workman, by troubling him onely at some times, makes a proportion so near be twixt the working of the one and the other, that both shall end as it were at one time. They can race storms and tempests in the air, either vpon sea or land, though not venuously, but in such a particular place and prescribed bounds, as God will permit them so to trouble, which likewise is very easy to be discerned from any other natural tempests that are meteors, in respect of the sudden and violent raising thereof, together with the short enduring of the same. And this is likewise very possible to their master to do, he hoing such affinity with the air as being a spirit, and hoing such power of the forming and muying thereof, as he ha heard me already declare. For in the scripture, that style of the prince of the air is gunvnto him. They can make folks to become frantic or maniac, which likewise is very possible to their master to do, since they are but natural sicknesses, and so he may lay on these kinds as well as any others. They can make spirits either to follow and trouble persons, or haunt certain houses, and affray oftentimes the inhabitants, as hath been known to be done by our witches at this time. And likewise they can make some to be possessed with spirits, and so to become very demoniacs, and this last sort is very possible likewise to the jewel their master to do, since he may easily send his own angels to trouble in what form he pleases, any whom God will permit him so to vsc. Fie, but will God permit these wicked instruments by the power of the jewel their master, to trouble by any of these means, any that believes in him? EPI. No doubt, for there are three kind of folks whom God will permit so to be tempted or troubled, the wicked for their horrible sins, to punish them in the like measure, the godly that are sleeping in any great sins or infirmities and weakness in faith, to waken them vp the faster by such an vncuth form, and you and some of the best, that their patience may be tried before the world, as IOBS was. For why may not God vsc any kind of extraordinary punishment, when it pleases him, as well as the ordinary rods of sickness or other aduicities? Fie, who then may be free from these duelish practices? EPI. No man ought to presume so far as to promise any impunity to himself, for God hath before all beginnings preordinated as well the particular sorties of plagues as of benefits for every man, which in the own time he ordains them to be visited with, and yet ought we not to be the more afraid for that, of anything that the duel and his wicked instruments can do against versus. For we daily fight against the duel in 100th other ways. And therefore, as a valiant captain, affrays no more being at the combat, nor stays from his purpose for the rummishing shot of a cannon, nor the small clack of a pistolet. Suppose he be not certain what may light vpon him. You and so ought we boldly to go forward in fighting against the duel without any greater terror, for these his rarest weapons, nor for the ordinary whereof we ha daily the proof. Fie, is it not lawful then, by the help of some other witch, to cure the disease that is casten on by that craft? EPI. No ways lawful, for I gaw you the reason thereof in that axiom of theology, which was the last words I spake of magi. Fie, how then may these diseases be lawfully cured? EPI. Only by earnest prayer to God, by amendment of their leus, and by sharp pursuing every one, according to his calling of these instruments of Sathan, whose punishment to the death will be a salutary sacrifice for the patient. And this is not only the lawful way, but likewise the most sure. For by the duel's means can newer the duel be casten out, as Christ saith. And when such a cure is said, it may well sorrow for a short time, but at the last it will doubtlessly tend to the ter perdition of the patient, both in body and soul. Philometigs. BVT, who dare take vpon him to punish them, if no man can be sure to be free from their vn natural illusions. EPI. We ought not the more of that restrain from virtue, that the way whereby we climb thereunto be straight and perilous. But besides that, as there is no kind of persons so subject to receive harm of them, as these that are of infirm and weak faith, which is the best buckler against such illusions. So ha they so small power our none, as our such as zealously and earnestly pursues them, without sparing for any worldly respect. Fie, then they are like the pest, which smites these sickest, that flies it farthest, and apprehends deepliest the peril thereof. Epi, it is you and so with them, for neither is it able to them to vsc any false cure vpon a patient, except the patient first believe you in their power, and so hazard the tinsel of his own soul, nor yet can they ha less power to hurt Annie, nor such as contemns most their doings, so being it comes of faith, and not of any vain arrogancy in themselves. Fie, but what is their power against the magistrate? Epi, less or greater, according as he deals with them. For if he be slothful towards them, God is very able to make them instruments to waken and punish his sloth. But if he be the contrary, he according to the east law of God, and allowable law of all nations, will be diligent in examining and punishing of them. God will not permit their master to trouble or hinder so good a work. Fie, but fra they be once in hands and ferments, ha they any further power in their craft. Epi, that is according to the form of their detention. If they be but apprehended and detained by any preuate person, vpon other preuate respects, their power no doubt either in escaping, or in doing hurt, is no less nor ewer it was before. But if on the other part, their apprehending and detention be by the lawful magistrate, vpon the east respects of their guiltiness in that craft, their power is then no greater than before that ewer they meddled with their master. For where God begins eastly to strike by his lawful lieutenants, it is not in the duel's power to defraud or barrow him of the office, or effect of his powerful and ruinging scepter. Fie, but will newer their master come to visit them, fra they be once apprehended and put in ferments. Epi, that is according to the estate that these miserable wretches are in. For if they be obstinate in still denying, he will not spare, when he finds time to speak with them, either if he find them in any comfort, to fill them more and more with the vain hope of some manner of relief, or else if he find them in a deep despair, by all means to augment the same, and to persuade them by some extraordinary means to put themselves down, which very commonly they do. But if they be penitent and confess, God will not permit him to trouble them any more with his presence and allurements. Fie, it is not good sing his counsel I see then, but I would earnestly know when he appears to them in prison, what forms says he then to take. Epi, Dewer's forms, ewen as he says to do at other times vnto them. For as I told you, speaking of magi, he appears to that kind of craftsmen ordinarily in form, according as they agree vpon it amongst themselves, or if they be but prentices, according to the quality of their circles or conjurations. Yet to these capped creatures he appears as he pleases, and as he finds meetest for their humours. For ewen at their public connuncians, he appears to dewers of them in dewers' forms, as we ha found by the difference of their confessions in that point. For he deluding them with vain impressions in the air, makes himself to seem more terrible to the grosser sort, that they may thereby be moved to fear and ruerence him the more, and less monstrous and uncouth like agging to the craftier sort, least other ways they might stir and scunner at his gliness. Fie, how can he then be felt, as they confess they ha done him, if his body be but of air? Epi, I hear little of that amongst their confessions, yet may he make himself palpable, either by assuming any dead body, and sing the ministry thereof, or else by deluding as well their sense of feeling as seeing, which is not impossible to him to do, since all our senses, as we are so weak, and ewen by ordinary sicknesses will be oftentimes deluded. Fie, but I would speer one word further yet, concerning his appearing to them in prison, which is this. May any other that chances to be present at that time in the prison see him as well as they? Epi, sometimes they will and sometimes not, as it pleases God. Philometichias. Hath the duel then power to appear to any other, except to such as are his sworn disciples, especially since oracles and such like kinds of illusions were taken away and abolished by the coming of Christ. Epi, although it be true indeed that the brightness of the gospel at his coming scaled the clouds of all these gross errors in the gentilest me, yet that these abusing spirits ceases not sensinet sometimes to appear. Daily experience teaches versus indeed this difference is to be marked betwixt the forms of Sathans canoeing visibly in the world. For of two different forms thereof, the one of them by the spreading of the Evangel and conquest of the white horse in the 6th chapter of the Ruelation is much hindered and become rarer therethrough. This is appearing to any Christians, troubling of them outwardly, or possessing of them constrainedly. The other of them is become communer and more said sensine, I mean by their vien lawful arts, whereupon our whole purpose hath been. This we find by experience in this isle to be true. For as we know, moe ghosts and spirits were seen, nor tongue can tell, in the time of blind papistry in these countries, where now by the contrary, a man shall scarcely all his time hear once of such things. And yet were these vien lawful arts far rarer at that time, and newer were so much hard of, nor so rife as they are now. Fie, what should be the cause of that? EPI. The deus nature of our sins procures at the eustis of God, deus sorties of punishments answering thereunto. And therefore, as in the time of papistry, our fathers erring grossly, and through ignorance, that mist of errors overshadowed the duel to walk the more familiarly amongst them. And as it were by Barnelly and affraying terrors, to mock and accuse their Barnelly errors. By the contrary, we now being sound of religion, and in our life rebelling to our profession, God eously by that sin of rebellion, as Samuel calleth it, accuseth our life so wilfully fighting against our profession. Fie, since ye are entered now to speak of the appearing of spirits, I would be glad to hear your opinion in that matter. For many denies that any such spirits can appear in these days, as I ha said. EPI. Doubtlessly who denieth the power of the duel, would a likewise deny the power of God, if they could for shame. For since the duel is the very contrary opposite to God, there can be no better way to know God than by the contrary, as by the one's power, though a creature, to admire the power of the great Creator, by the falsehood of the one to consider the truth of the other, by the injustice of the one to consider the eustis of the other, and by the cruelty of the one to consider the mercifulness of the other, and so forth in all the rest of the essence of God and qualities of the duel. But I fear indeed there be many Sadduces in this world that denies all kinds of spirits, for convicting of whose error there is cause enough if there were no more, that God should permit at sometimes spirits visibly to keeth. PHILOMETHS. I pray you now then go forward in telling what ye think fabulous, or may be trode in that case. EPI. That kind of the jewels canoeing in the earth may be divided in 4 different kinds, whereby he affrayeth and troubleth the bodies of men. For of the abusing of the soul I ha spoken already. The first is, where spirits troubles some houses or solitary places. The second, where spirits follows vpon certain persons, and it dewers hours troubles them. The third, when they enter within them and possess them. The fourth is these kind of spirits that are called vulgarly the fairy. Of the 3 former kinds, ye heard already, how they may artificially be made by witchcraft to trouble folk. Now it rests to speak of their natural calming as it were, and not raised by witchcraft. But generally I must forewarn you of one thing before I enter in this purpose. That is, that although in my discoursing of them, I do hide them in divers kinds, ye must notwithstanding thereof note my phrase of speaking in that. For doubtlessly they are in effect, but all one kind of spirits, who for abusing the more of mankind, takes on these sundry shapes, and says deus forms of outward actions, as if some were of nature better than other. No, I return to my purpose. As to the first kind of these spirits, that were called by the ancients by dewers names, according as their actions were. For if they were spirits that haunted some houses, by appearing in dewers and horrible forms, and making great din, they were called lemuries or spectra. If they appeared in likeness of Annie defunct to some friends of his, they were called viembri mortuorum, and so innumerable styles they got, according to their actions, as I ha said already. As we see by experience, how many styles they ha given them in our language in the like manner. Of the appearing of these spirits, we are certified by the scriptures, where the prophet Esay 13 and 34, cap, threatening the destruction of Babel and Edom, declares that it shall not only be racked, but shall become so great a solitude, as it shall be the habitacle of Howlets, and of Ziim and Iim, which are the proper Hebrew names for these spirits. The cause why they haunt solitary places, it is by reason that they may affray and brangle the more the faith of such as them alone haunts such places. For our nature is such, as in companies we are not so soon moved to any such kind of fear, as being solitaire, which the duel knowing well enow, he will not therefore assail these but when we are weak. And besides that, God will not permit him so to dishonor the societies and companies of Christians, as in public times and places to walk visibly amongst them. On the other part, when he troubles certain houses that are dwelt in, it is a sure token either of gross ignorance, or of some gross and slanderous sins amongst the inhabitants thereof, which God by that extraordinary rod punishes. Fie, but by what way or passage can these spirits enter in these houses, seeing they allege that they will enter, door and window being staked? EPI, they will choose the passage for their entrance, according to the form that they are in at that time. For if they ha assumed a dead body, whereinto they lodge themselves, they can easily enow open without din any door or window, and enter in thereat. And if they enter as a spirite only, any place where the air may come in at, is large enow an entry for them. For as I said before, a spirite can occupy no quantity. Fie, and will God then permit these wicked spirits to trouble the reste of a dead body, before the resurrection thereof? Or if he will so, I think it should be of the reprobate only. EPI, what more is the reste troubled of a dead body, when the duel carries it out of the graw to sarrow his turn for a space, nor when the witches takes it VP and joints it, or when as swine wirts VPP the graws. The rest of them that the scripture speaks of is not meaned by a local remaining continually in one place, but by their resting from their troels and miseries of this worlde, while their latter conjunction again with the soul at that time to resow full glory in both. And that the duel may VSC aswell the ministry of the bodies of the faithful in these cases, as of the VN faithful, there is no inconvenient, for his haunting with their bodies after they are dead can no ways defile them, in respect of the soul's absence. And for any dishonor it can be VNTO them, by what reason can it be greater than the hanging, heading, or many such shameful deaths that good men will suffer? For there is nothing in the bodies of the faithful more worthy of honor or freer from corruption by nature, nor in these of the VN faithful, while time they be purged and glorified in the latter day, as is daily seen by the vilde diseases and corruptions, that the bodies of the faithful are subject VNTO, as ye will see clearly proud, when I speak of the possessed and demoniacs. Fie, yet there are sundry that affirms to ha haunted such places, where these spirits are alleged to be, and could a newer hear nor see any thing. EPI, I think well, for that is only reserved to the secret knowledge of God, whom he will permit to see such things, and whom not. Fie, but where these spirits haunts and troubles any houses, what is the best way to banish them? EPI, by two means may onely the remade of such things be procured. The one is ardent prayer to God, both of these persons that are troubled with them, and of that church whereof they are. The other is the purging of themselves by amendment of life from such sins, as ha procured that extraordinary plague. Fie, and what means then these kinds of spirits, when they appear in the shadow of a person newly dead, or to die to his friends? EPI, when they appear upon that occasion, they are called wraiths in our language. Amongst the Gentiles the dual said that much, to make them believe that it was some good spirit that appeared to them then, either to forewarn them of the death of their friend, or else to discover VNTO them, the will of the defunct, or what was the way of his slaughter, as is written in the book of the histories prodigious. And this way he easily deceived the Gentiles, because they knew not God. And to that same effect is it, that he now appears in that manner to some ignorant Christians. For he dare not so elude any that knoweth that, neither can the spirit of the defunct return to his friend, or yet an angel VSC such forms. Fie, and are not our werewolves one sort of these spirits also, that haunts and troubles some houses or dwelling places? EPI, there hath indeed been an old opinion of such like things, for by the Greeks they were called lambda epsilon kappa alpha nu theta rho omega pi omicron iota, which signifieth men wolves. But to tell you simply my opinion in this, if any such thing hath been, I take it to ha proceeded but of a natural superabundance of melancholy, which as we read, that it hath made some think themselves pitchers, and some horses, and some one kind of beast or other. So suppose I that it hath so vitiate the imagination and memory of some, as per lucida interruela, it hath so highly occupied them, that they ha thought themselves very wolves indeed at these times. And so ha counterfeited their actions in going on their hands and feet, priassing to doer women and barns, fighting and snatching with all the town dogges, and invising such like other brutish actions, and so to become beasts by a strong apprehension, as Nebuchadnezzar was sew in years. But as to their hoeing and hiding of their hard and shelly sloughs, I take that to be but iked, by VN certain report, the author of all lies. Philometichias. Come forward now to the reste of these kinds of spirits. EPI. As to the next two kinds, that is, either these that outwardly troubles and follow some persons, or else inwardly possesses them, I will conjoin them in one, because as well the causes are alike in the persons that they are permitted to trouble, as also the ways whereby they may be remedied and cured. Phi, what kind of persons are they that V says to be so troubled? EPI. Two kinds in special. Either such as being guilty of grievous offenses, God punishes by that horrible kind of scourge, or else being persons of the beste nature peradunture, that ye shall find in all the country about them. God permits them to be troubled in that sort, for the trial of their patience, and wakening VP of their zeal, for admonishing of the beholders, not to trust our much in themselves, since they are made of no better stuff, and peradunture blotted with no smaller sins, as Christ said. Speaking of them VP Pon whom the towar in Siloam fell, and for GUing likewise to the spectators, matter to praise God, that they meriting no better, are yet spared from being corrected in that fearful form. Phi, these are good reasons for the part of God, which apparently muyus him so to permit the duel to trouble such persons. But since the duel hath ewer a contrary respect in all the actions that God employs him in, which is I pray you the end, and mark he shoots at in this turn. EPI, it is to obtain one of two things thereby, if he may. The one is the tinsel of their life, by inducing them to such perilous places at such time as he either follows or possesses them, which may procure the same. And such like, so far as God will permit him, by tormenting them to weaken their body and cast them in incurable diseases. The other thing that he preases to obtain by troubling of them is the tinsel of their soul, by enticing them to mistrust and blaspheme God, either for the intolerableness of their torments, as he assayed to ha done with Iob, or else for his promising VNTO them to low the troubling of them, in case they would so do, as is known by experience at this same time by the confession of a young one that was so troubled. Phi, since he ha spoken now of both these kinds of spirits comprehending them in one, I must no go back ye agin in spearing some questions of Uri, one of these kinds in special. And first for these that follows certain persons, ye know that there are two sorties of them, one sort that troubles and torments the persons that they haunt with, and other sort that are serviceable VNTO them in all kind of their necessaries, and omits newer to forewarn them of any sudden peril that they are to be in. And so in this case, I would understand whether both these sorties be but wicked and damned spirits, or if the last sort be rather angels, as should appear by their actions, sent by God to assist such as he specially fors. For it is written in the scriptures that God sends legions of angels to guard and watch our his elect. EPI, I know well enough wherefore that error which ye allege hath proceeded, for it was the ignorant Gentiles that were the fountain thereof. Who for that they knew not God, they forged in their own imaginations, Uri man to be still accompanied with two spirits, whereof they called the one genius bonus, the other genius malus. The Greeks called them epsilon upsilon delta alpha iota mu omicron nu alpha, and kappa omicron delta alpha iota mu omicron nu alpha. Whereof the former, they said, persuaded him to all the good he did, the other enticed him to all the you will. But praised be God, we that are Christians, and walks not amongst the Cimmerian conjectures of man, knows well enough that it is the good spirit of God only, who is the fountain of all goodness, that persuades verses to the thinking or doing of any good, and that it is our corrupted flesh and sathan that enticeth verses to the contrary. And yet the duel for confirming in the heads of ignorant Christians, that error first maintained among the Gentiles, he whiles among the first kind of spirits that I speak of, appeared in time of papistry and blindness, and haunted Dewar's houses, without doing any uil, but doing as it were necessary turns VP and down the house. And this spirit they called Brownie in our language, who appeared like a rough man. Yea, some were so blinded as to believe that their house was all the sunsier, as they called it, that such spirits resorted there. Fie, but since the duel's intention in all his actions is you were to do uil, what uil was there in that form of doing, since their actions outwardly were good? EPI, was it not uil enough to deceive simple ignorance, in making them to take him for an angel of light, and so to account of God's enemy as of their particular friend? Whereby the contrary, all we that are Christians ought assuredly to know that since the coming of Christ in the flesh, and establishing of his church by the apostles, all miracles, visions, prophecies, and appearances of angels or good spirits are ceased, which served only for the first sowing of faith and planting of the church. Where now the church being established, and the white horse whereof I spake before, having made his conquest, the law and prophets are thought sufficient to serve these, or make verses inexcusable, as Christ saith in his parable of Lazarus and the rich man. The next question that I would speer is likewise concerning this first of these two kinds of spirits that ye ha conjoined. And it is this: ye know how it is commonly written and reported, that amongst the rest of the sorties of spirits that follow certain persons, there is one more monstrous nor all the rest. In respect as it is alleged, they converse naturally with them whom they trouble and haunts with, and therefore I would know in two things your opinion herein. First, if such a thing can be, and next, if it be. Whether there be a difference of sexes amongst these spirits or not. EPI, that abominable kind of the duel's abusing of men or women was called of old incubi and succubi, according to the difference of the sexes that they canoeist with. By two means this great kind of abuse might possibly be performed. The one, when the duel only as a spirit, and stealing out the sperm of a dead body, abuses them that way, they not greatly seeing any shape or feeling any thing, but that which he so canoes in that part, as we read of a monastery of nuns which were burnt for their being that way abused. The other mean is when he borrows a dead body and so visibly, and as it seems VNTO them naturally, as a man converses with them. But it is to be noted that in whatsoever way he saith it, that sperm seems intolerably cold to the person abused. For if he steal out the nature of a quick person, it cannot be so quickly carried, but it will both tine the strength and heat by the way, which it could newer ha had for lackey of agitation, which in the time of procreation is the procurer and waken a VP of these two natural qualities. And if he occupying the dead body as his lodging expel the same out thereof in the due time, it must likewise be cold by the participation with the qualities of the dead body whereout of it comes. And whereas ye inquire if these spirits be divided in sexes or not, I think the rules of philosophy may easily resolve a man of the contrary. For it is a sure principle of that art, that nothing can be divided in sexes, except such lewing bodies as must ha a natural seed to gener by. But we know spirits hath no seed proper to themselves, nor yet can they gender one with another. Fie, how is it then that they say sundry monsters ha been begotten by that way? EPI, these tales are nothing but annals fabulae, for that they ha no nature of their own, I ha showed you already. And that the cold nature of a dead body can work nothing in generation, it is more nor plain, as being already dead of itself as well as the rest of the body is, wanting the natural heat and such other natural operation, as is necessary for working that effect, and in case such a thing were possible, which were all utterly against all the rules of nature, it would breed no monster, but only such a natural of spring. As would ha comed betwixt that man or woman and that other abused person, in case they both being aliu had had a doe with other. For the duel's part therein is but the naked carrying or expelling of that substance, and so it could not participate with no quality of the same. Indeed, it is possible to the craft of the duel to make a woman's belly to swell after he hath that way abused her, which he may do, either by staring VP her own humor, or by herbs, as we see beggars daily do. And when the time of her delirium should come to make her thoil great dollars, like VNTO that natural course, and then subtly to slip in the midwiu's hands, stocks, stones, or some monstrous barn brought from some other place. But this is more reported and jest at by others, nor believed by me. Fie, but what is the cause that this kind of abuse is thought to be most common in such wild parts of the world as Lapland and Finland, or in our North Isles of Orkney and Shetland? EPI. Because where the duel finds greatest ignorance and barbarity, there assails he grossliest, as I gaw you the reason wherefore there was moe witches of womankind nor men. Fie, can any be so happy as to gie you their willing consent to the duel's vilda, abusing them in this form? EPI. Yea, some of the witches ha confessed, that he hath persuaded them to gie you their willing consent thereunto, that he may thereby ha them felted the sickerer in his snares. But as the other compelled sort is to be pitied and prayed for, so is this most highly to be punished and detested. Fie, it is not the thing which we call the mare, which takes folks sleeping in their beds, a kind of these spirits whereof ye are speaking. EPI. No, that is but a natural sickness, which the mediciners hath gie you in that name of incubus vento ob incubando, because it being a thick flume, falling into our breast vipon the heart, while we are sleeping, intercludes so our vital spirits, and takes all power from these, as Max Versus think that there were some VN natural burden or spirit, lying vpon v's and holding Versus down. Philometichias. Well, I ha told you now all my doubts, and ye ha satisfied me therein, concerning the first of these two kinds of spirits that ye ha conjoined. Now I am to inquire only two things at you concerning the last kind, I mean the demoniacus. The first is, whereby shall these possessed folks be discerned fra them that are troubled with a natural frenzy or manie? The next is, how can it be that they can be remedied by the Papists' church, whom we counting as heretics? It should appear that one duel should not cast out another, for then would his kingdom be deuited in itself, as Christ said. EPI. As to your first question, there are deuers symptoms, whereby that holy trouble may be discerned from a natural sickness, and specially three, omitting the deuers vain signs that the Papists attributes vnto it, such as the raging at holy water, their fleeing aback from the cross, their not abiding the hearing of God named, and innumerable such like vain things that were alike fascious and feckles to recite. But to come to these three symptoms then, whereof I spake, I account the one of them to be the incredible strength of the possessed creature, which will far exceed the strength of 6 of the whitest and woedest of any other men that are not so troubled. The next is the boldening VP so far of the patient's breast and belly, with such an VN natural stirring and vehement agitation within them, and such an irony hardness of his sinews, so stiffly bended out, that it were not possible to prick out as it were the skin of any other person so far. So mightily works the duel in all the members and senses of his body, he being locally within the same, suppose of his soul and affections thereof, he ha no more power than of any other man's. The last is, the speaking of sundry languages, which the patient is known by them that were acquaint with him newer to ha learned, and that with an vieng couth and hollow voice, and all the time of his speaking, a greater motion being in his breast than in his mouth. But fra this last symptom is accepted such, as are altogether in the time of their possessing bereft of all their senses being possessed with a dumb and blind spirit, whereof Christ relayed one in the 12 of Matthew. And as to your next demand, it is first to be doubted if the Papists or Annie not professing the onely true religion can relieve Annie of that trouble. And next, in case they can, vpon what respects it is possible vnto them. As to the former vpon 2 reasons, it is grounded. First, that it is known so many of them to be counterfeit, which while the clergy inwentes for confirming of their rotten religion. The next is, that by experience we find that few, who are possessed indeed, are fully cured by them. But rather the duel is content to release the bodily hurting of them, for a short space, thereby to obtain the perpetual hurt of the souls of so many that by these false miracles may be induced or confirmed in the profession of that erroneous religion. Ewan, as I told you before that he doth in the false cures, or casting off of diseases by witches. As to the other part of the argument in case they can, which rather, with ruerance of the learned thinking other ways, I am induced to believe you, by reason of the faithful report that men sound of religion, ha made according to their sight thereof. I think if so be, I say these may be the respects, whereupon the papists may ha that power. Christ gaw a commission and power to his apostles to cast out duels, which they according thereunto put in execution. The rules he bade them observe in that action was fasting and prayer, and the action itself to be done in his name. This power of theirs proceeded not then of any virtue in them, but only in him who directed them. As was clearly proud by Eudes his hawing as great power in that commission, as Annie of the Reste. It is easy then to be understand that the casting out of duels is by the virtue of fasting and prayer, and in calling of the name of God, suppose many imperfections be in the person that is the instrument, as Christ himself teacheth verses of the power that false prophets saw ha to cast out devils. It is no wonder, then, these respects of this action being considered, that it may be possible to the papists, though erring in sundry points of religion to accomplish this, if they see the right form prescribed by Christ herein. For what the worse is that action that they err in other things, more than their baptismy is the worse that they err in the other sacrament, and ha iked many vain freights to the baptismy itself. Fie, surely it is no little wonder that God should permit the bodies of Annie of the faithful to be so dishonored, as to be a dwelling place to that unclean spirit. EPI, there is it which I told right now, would prove you and strengthen my argument of the duels entering in the dead bodies of the faithful. For if he is permitted to enter in their leewing bodies, ewen when they are armed with the soul, how much more will God permit him to enter in their dead carrions, which is no more man, but the filthy and corruptible case of man? For as Christ saith, it is not anything that enters within man that defiles him, but only that which proceeds and cometh out of him. Philometiges. Now I pray you come on to that fourth kind of spirits. EPI, that fourth kind of spirits, which by the Gentiles was called Diana, and her wandering court, and amongst these was called the fairy, as I told you or our good neighbors, was one of the sorties of illusions that was rifest in the time of papistry. For although it was holden odious to prophecy by the duel, yet whom these kind of spirits carried away and informed, they were thought to be sunsiest and of best life. To speak of the many vain trattles founded vipon that illusion, how there was a king and queen of fairy, of such a ially court and train as they had, how they had attained, and duty, as it were, of all goods, how they naturally rode and went, eat and drank, and did all other actions like natural men and women. I think it liker virgils campi elisage, nor anything that ought to be believed by Christians, except in general, that as I spake sundry times before, the duel eluded the senses of sundry simple creatures, in making them believe that they saw and heard such things as were nothing so indeed. Fie, but how can it be then, that sundry witches ha gone to death with that confession, that they ha been transported with the fairy to such a hill, which opening, they went in, and there saw a fair queen, who being now lighter, gaw them a stone that had sundry virtues, which at sundry times hath Benny produced in judgment. EPI, I say that, ewen as I said before of that imaginar rising of the spirit forth of the body. For may not the dual object to their fantasy, their senses being dulled, and as it were asleep, such hills and houses within them, such glistering courts and trains, and whatsoever such like wherewith he pleaseth to delude them. And in the meantime their bodies being senseless, to canoe in their hand any stone or such like thing, which he makes them to imagine to ha received in such a place. Fie, but what say ye to their foretelling the death of sundry persons, whom they allege to ha seen in these places? That is, a sooth dream, as they say, since they see it walking. EPI, I think that either they ha not been sharply enow examined, that gaw so blunt a reason for their prophecy, or otherways, I think it likewise is possible that the duel may prophecy to them when he deceives their imaginations in that sort, as well as when he plainly speaks vnto them at other times for their prophesying, is but by a kind of vision, as it were, wherein he commonly counterfeits God among the ethnics, as I told you before. Fie, I would know now whether these kinds of spirits may only appear to witches, or if they may also appear to any other. EPI, they may do to both, to the innocent sort, either to affray them, or to seem to be a better sort of folks nor clean spirits are, and to the witches to be a color of safety for them, that ignorant magistrates may not punish them for it, as I told Ewan now. But as the one sort, for being perforce troubled with them ought to be pitted, so ought the other sort, who may be discerned by their taking VP upon them to prophecy by them. That sort, I say, ought as surely to be punished as any other witches, and rather the more that they go dissemblingly to work. Fie, and what makes the spirits ha so different names from others? EPI, Ewan the nowery of that same duel, who as he eludes the necromancers with innumerable feigned names for him and his angels, as in special, making Sathan, Beelzebub, and Lucifer to be three sundry spirits, where we find the two former, but Dewars names Gewan to the prince of all the rebelling angels by the scripture. As by Christ, the prince of all the duels is called Beelzebub in that place, which I alleged against the power of any heretics to cast out duels. By Iohn in the Ruelation, the old tempter is called Sathan the prince of all the Ewell angels, and the last, to wit Lucifer, is but by allegoric taken from the day star, so named in Dewars places of the scriptures, because of his excellency, I mean the prince of them in his creation before his fall. Ewan so I say he disowns the witches, by attributing to himself Dewars names, as if Ewery Dewars shape that he transforms himself in were a Dewars kind of spirit. Fie, but I ha heard many moe strange tales of this fairy, nor ye ha yet told me. EPI, as well I do in that as I did in all the rest of my discourse. For because the ground of this conference of ours proceeded of your spearing at me at our meeting, if there was such a thing as witches or spirits, and if they had any power, I therefore ha framed my whole discours, only to prow that such things are and may be, by such number of examples as I show to be possible by reason. And keeps me from dipping any further in playing the part of a dictionary, to tell what you or I ha read or hard in that purpose, which both would exceed faith, and rather would seem to teach such lawful arts, nor to disallow and condemn them, as it is the duty of all Christians to do. PHILOMETGS. Then to make an end of our conference, since I see it draws late, what form of punishment think ye merits these magicians and witches? For I see that ye account them to be all alike guilty. EPI. They ought to be put to death according to the law of God, the civil and imperial law, and municipal law of all Christian nations. Fie, but what kind of death, I pray you? EPI. It is commonly said by fire, but that is an indifferent thing to be said in Ewery country, according to the law or custom thereof. Fie, but ought no sex, age nor rank to be exempted. EPI. None at all, being so said by the lawful magistrate, for it is the highest point of idolatry, wherein no exception is admitted by the law of God. Fie, then bairns may not be spared. EPI. Yea, not a hair the less of my conclusion, for they are not that capable of reason as to practice such things, and for any being in company and not ruling thereof, their less and ignorant age will no doubt excuse them. Fie, I see ye condemn them all that are of the counsel of such crafts. EPI. No doubt, for as I said, speaking of magi, the consulters, trusters in, overseers, entertainers or stirrers VP of these craftsfolks, are equally guilty with themselves that are the practisers. Fie, whether may the prince then, or supreme magistrate, spare or oversee any that are guilty of that craft, vpon some great respects known to him. EPI. The prince or magistrate for further trial's cause may continue the punishing of them such a certain space as he thinks convenient, but in the end to spare the life, and not to strike when God bids strike, and so sewerely punish in so odious a fault and treason against God, it is not only lawful, but doubtless no less sin in that magistrate, nor it was in savles sparing of AGAG, and so comparable to the sin of witchcraft itself, as SAMVLL alleged at that time. Fie, surely then, I think since this crime ought to be so sewerely punished, judges ought to beware to condemn any, but such as they are sure are guilty, neither should the clattering report of a carling sorrow in so weighty a case. EPI. Judges ought indeed to beware whom they condemn, for it is as great a crime as SALOMON saith, to condemn the innocent, as to let the guilty escape free. Neither ought the report of any one infamous person be admitted for a sufficient proof, which can stand of no law. Fie, and what may a number then of guilty persons' confessions work against one that is accused? EPI, the assize must sorrow for interpretor of our law in that respect. But in my opinion, since in a matter of treason against the prince, Barnes or Weus, or newer so defamed persons, may of our law sorrow for sufficient witnesses and proofs. I think surely that by a far greater reason, such witnesses may be sufficient in matters of high treason against God. For who but witches can be pruyus, and so witnesses of the doings of witches? Fie, indeed, I trow they will be loath to put any honest man vipon their counsel. But what if they accuse folk to ha beni present at their imaginar connuncians in the spirit, when their bodies lies senseless, as ye ha said? EPI, I think they are not a hair the less guilty, for the duel durst newer ha borrowed their shadow or similitude to that turn, if their consent had not been at it, and the consent in these turns is death of the law. Fie, then Samvel was a witch, for the duel resembled his shape, and played his person in genuine response to Savle. EPI, Samvel was dead as well before that, and so none could slander him with meddling in that Vien lawful art. For the cause why, as I take it, that God will not permit Sathan to see the shapes or similitudes of any innocent persons at such Vien lawful times, is that God will not permit that any innocent persons shall be slandered with that vile defection. For then the duel would find ways anew to calumniate the best. And this we ha in proof by them that are carried with the fairy, who newer see the shadows of any in that curt, but of them that thereafter are tried to ha beny brethren and sisters of that craft. And this was likewise proud by the confession of a young lass, troubled with spirits, laid on her by witchcraft. That although she saw the shapes of deus men and women troubling her, and naming the persons whom these shadows represents, yet newer one of them are found to be innocent, but Al clearly tried to be most guilty, and the most part of them confessing the same. And besides that, I think it hath been seldom hard tell of, that any whom persons guilty of that crime accused, as hawing known them to be their marrows by eyesight, and not by hearsay, but such as were so accused of witchcraft, could not be clearly tried vipon them, were at the least publicly known to be of a very eul life and reputation. So eolus is God, I say, of the fame of them that are innocent in such causes. And besides that, there are two other good helps that may be said for their trial. The one is the finding of their mark, and the trying the insensibles thereof. The other is their fleeting on the water. For as in a secret murder, if the dead carcase be at any time thereafter handled by the murderer, it will gush out of bloud, as if the blood were crying to the hoen for ruinge of the murderer. God hoing appointed that secret supernatural scene, for trial of that secret Vien natural crime. So it appears that God hath appointed, for a supernatural scene of the monstrous impiety of the witches, that the water shall refuse to receive them in her bosom, that ha shaken off them the sacred water of baptismy, and wilfully refuse the benefit thereof. No, not so much as their eyes are able to shed tears, threaten and torture them as ye please, while first they repent, God not permitting them to dissemble their obstinacy in so horrible a crime, albeit the womenkind especially, be able other ways to shed tears at ewery light occasion when they will, yea, although it were dissemblingly like the crocodiles. Fie, well, we ha made this conference to last as long as leisure would permit. And to conclude then, since I am to take my low of you, I pray God to purge this country of these deulish practices, for they were newer so rife in these parts as they are now. EPI, I pray God that so be too. But the causes are our manifest that makes them to be so rife. For the great wickedness of the people on the one part procures this horrible defection, whereby God justly punisheth sin by a greater iniquity. And on the other part, the consummation of the worlda and our deliverance drawing near makes Sathan to rage the more in his instruments, knowing his kingdom to be so near an end. And so farewell for this time. Venus. The manifold Vien truths which is spread abroad, concerning the detestable actions and apprehension of those witches, whereof this history following truly entreateth, hath caused me to publish the same in print. And and the rather for that sundry written copies are lately dispersed thereof, containing that the said witches were first discoured by means of a poor pedlar troiling to the town of Trenant, and that by a wonderful manner he was in a moment canoed at midnight, from Scotland to Bordeaux in France, being places of no small distance between, into a merchant's cellar there, and after, being sent from Bordeaux into Scotland by certain Scottish merchants to the king's majesty, that he discoured those witches and was the cause of their apprehension, with a number of matters miraculous and incredible, all which in truth are most false. Newerthels to satisfy a number of honest minds, who are desirous to be informed of the verity and truth of their confessions, which for certainty is more stranger than the common report runneth, and yet with more truth I ha undertaken to publish this short treatise, which declareth the true discourse of all that hath happened, and as well what was pretended by those wicked and detestable witches against the king's majesty, as also by what means they wrought the same. All which examinations, gentle reader, I ha here truly published, as they were taken and uttered in the presence of the king's majesty, praying thee to accept it for verity, the same being so true as cannot be reproud. A true discourse of the apprehension of sundry witches lately taken in Scotland, some are executed, and some are yet imprisoned, with a particular recital of their examinations, taken in the presence of the king's majesty. God by his omnipotent power hath at all times and daily doth take such care, and is so vigilant for the weal and preservation of his own, that thereby he disappointeth the wicked practices and evil intents of all such as by any means whatsoever seek indirectly to conspire anything contrary to his holy will. Yea, and by the same power, he hath lately overthrown and hindered the intentions and wicked dealings of a great number of ungodly creatures, no better than deals, who suffering themselves to be allured and enticed by the deal whom they served, and to whom they were previously sworn, entered into the detestable art of witchcraft, which they studied and practiced so long time, that in the end they had seduced by their sorcery a number of other to be as bad as themselves, dwelling in the bounds of Lothian, which is a principal shire or part of Scotland, where the king's majesty viseth to make his chiefest residence or abode. And to the end that their detestable wickedness which they previously had pretended against the king's majesty, the commonweal of that country, with the nobility and subjects of the same, should come to light. God of his unspeakable goodness did rule and lay it open in very strange sort, there be to make known to the worlda, that their actions were contrary to the law of God, and the natural affection which we ought generally to bear one to another. The manner of the ruling whereof was as followeth. Within the town of Trenant in the kingdom of Scotland, there dwelleth one Doyd Seaton, who being deputy bailiff in the said town, had a maid Sarowant called Jayleys Dunking, who said secretly to be absent and to lie forth of her maester's house every other night. This Jayleys Dunking took in hand to help all such as were troubled or grieved with any kind of sickness or infirmity, and in short space did perform many matters most miraculous, which things forasmuch as she began to do them vpon a sodding, hoeing newer doon the like before, made her maester and others to be in great admiration, and wondered thereat, by means whereof the said Doyd Seaton had his maid in some great suspicion, that she did not those things by natural and lawful ways, but rather supposed it to be doon by some extraordinary and unlawful means. Whereupon her maester began to grow very inquisitive, and examined her which way and by what means she were able to perform matters of so great importance. Whereat she gaw him no answer, nevertheless, her maester to the intent that he might the better try and find out the truth of the same, did with the help of others, torment her with the torture of the pillywinks vpon her fingers, which is a grievous torture, and binding or wrenching her head with a cord or rope, which is a most cruel torment also, yet would she not confess anything, whereupon they suspecting that she had been marked by the deil, as commonly witches are, made diligent search about her, and found the enemy's mark to be in her fore crag or forepart of her throat, which being found, she confessed that all her doings was doon by the wicked allurements and enticements of the deil, and that she did them by witchcraft. After this her confession, she was committed to prison, where she continued for a season, where immediately she accused these persons following to be notorious witches, and caused them forthwith to be apprehended one after another, vids. Agnes Sampson, the eldest witch of them all, dwelling in Haddington, Agnes Thompson of Edinburgh, Dr. Fyon, alias Ione Cunningham, maester of the school at Saltpans in Lothian, of whose life and strange acts you shall hear more largely in the end of this discourse. These were by the said Jayles Duncan accused, as also George Mott's wife dwelling in Saltpans, Robert Grierson skipper, and Yennet Bandalandes, with the porter's wife of Seaton, the smith at the Brig Halleys with innumerable others in that parts, and dwelling in those bounds aforesaid, of whom some are already executed, the rest remain in prison, to receive the doom of judgment at the King's Majesty's will and pleasure. The said Jayles Duncan also caused Euphame Meilrian to be apprehended, who conspired and performed the death of her godfather, and who said her art vipon, a gentleman being one of the lords and eastesses of the session, for bearing good will to her daughter. She also caused to be apprehended one Barbara Napier, for bewitching to death Archibalda, last Earl of Angus, who languished to death by witchcraft, and yet the same was not suspected, but that he died of so strange a disease, as the physician knew not how to cure or remedy the same. But of all other the said witches, these two last before recited, were reputed for as ill honest women as any that dwelled within the city of Edinburgh, before they were apprehended. Many other besides were taken dwelling in Lyeth, who are detained in prison, until his Majesty's further will and pleasure be known, of whose wicked doings you shall particularly hear, which was as followeth. This aforesaid Agnes Sampson, which was the elder witch, was taken and brought to Hallasiad House before the King's Majesty and sundry other of the nobility of Scotland, where she was straitly examined. But all the persuasions which the King's Majesty said to her with the rest of his council might not provoke or induce her to confess anything, but stood stiffly in the denial of all that was laid to her charge. Whereupon they caused her to be canoed away to prison, there to receive such torture as hath been lately provided for witches in that country. And forasmuch as by due examination of witchcraft and witches in Scotland, it hath lately been found that the dual doth generally mark them with a preui mark, by reason the witches ha confessed themselves, that the deal doth lick them with his tongue in some part of their body, before he doth receive them to be his servants, which mark commonly is in them ender the hair in some part of their body, whereby it may not easily be found out or seen, although they be searched. And generally so long as the mark is not seen to those which search them, so long the parties that hath the mark will newer confess anything. Therefore by special commandment, this Agnes Sampson had all her hair shorn of, in each part of her body, and her head thrawn with a rope according to the custom of that country, being a pain most grievous, which she continued almost an hour, during which time she would not confess anything until the deal's mark was found upon her preuities. Then she immediately confessed whatsoever was demanded of her, and justifying those persons aforesaid to be notorious witches. Item, the said Agnes Thompson was after brought again before the King's Majesty and his council, and being examined of the meetings and detestable dealings of those witches, she confessed that upon the night of All Hallow Ewen last, she was accompanied as well with the persons aforesaid, as also with a great many other witches, to the number of 200. And that all they together went by sea each one in a riddle or seau, and went in the same very substantially with flagons of wine making merry and drinking by the way in the same riddles or seus, to the kirk of North Berwick in Lothian, and that after they had landed, took hands on the land and danced this ryle or short dance, singing all with one voice. Come or go ye before, come or go ye. If ye will not go before, come or let me. At which time she confessed that this J. Duncan did go before them playing this ryle or dance upon a small trump, called a ewes trump, until they entered into the kirk of North Berwick. These confessions made the king in a wonderful admiration, and sent for the said Jayles Duncan, who upon the like trump did play the said dance before the King's Majesty, who in respect of the strangings of these matters took great delight to be present at their examinations. Item, the said Agnes Thompson confessed that the deal being then at North Berwick Kirk attending their calming in the habit or likens of a man, and seeing that they tarried hour long, He at their calming enjoined them all to a penance, which was, that they should kiss his buttocks, in scene of duty to him, which being put o'er the pulpit bar, every one did as he had enjoined them. And hawing made his viang godly exhortations, wherein he did greatly inveigh against the King of Scotland. He received their oaths for their good and true service towards him, and departed. Which doon, they returned to sea, and so home again. At which time the witches demanded of the deil why he did bear such hatred to the king, who answered, by reason the king is the greatest enemy he hath in the worlda. All which their confessions and depositions are still extant vpon record. Item, the said Agnes Sampson confessed before the king's majesty sundry things which were so miraculous and strange, as that his majesty said they were all extreme liars, whereat she answered, she would not wish his majesty to suppose her words to be false, but rather to believe them, in that she would discour such matter vnto him as his majesty should not any way doubt of. And the rupon taking his majesty a little aside, she declared vnto him the verye words which passed between the king's majesty and his queen at Peaslow in Norway the first night of their marriage, with their answer each to other. Whereat the king's majesty wondered greatly, and swore by the leewing God, that he believed that all the deils in hell could not ha discoured the same, acknowledging her words to be most true, and therefore gaw the more credit to the rest which is before declared. Touching this Agnes Thompson, she is the only woman, who by the deil's persuasion should ha intended and put in execution the king's majesty's death in this manner. She confessed that she took a blacky toad, and did hang the same VP by the heels, 3 days, and collected and gathered the venom as it dropped and fell from it in an oyster shell, and kept the same venom close cowered, until she should obtain any part or piece of foul linen cloth that had appertained to the king's majesty, as shirt, handkercher, napkin, or any other thing which she practiced to obtain by means of one Ion Curs, who being attendant in his majesty's chamber, desired him for oldie acquaintance between them, to help her to one or a piece of such a cloth as is aforesaid, which thing the said Ion Curs denied to help her to, saying he could not help her to it. And the said Agnes Thompson by her depositions since her apprehension saith, that if she had obtained any one piece of linen cloth which the king had worn and fouled, she had bewitched him to death, and put him to such extraordinary pains, as if he had been lying vpon sharp thorns and ends of needles. More where she confessed that at the time when his majesty was in Denmark, she being accompanied with the parties before specially named, took a cat and christened it, and afterward bound to each part of that cat the chiefest parts of a dead man, and sewer all eints of his body, and that in the night following the said cat was canoed into the midst of the sea by all these witches sailing in their riddles or seas as is aforesaid, and so left the said cat right before the town of Leith in Scotland. This doon there did arise such a tempest in the sea, as a greater hath not been seen, which tempest was the cause of the perishing of a boat or vessel coming hour from the town of Brunt Illand to the town of Leith, wherein was sundry jewels and rich gifts, which should ha been presented to the now Queen of Scotland, at her majesty's coming to Leith. Again it is confessed, that the said christened cat was the cause that the king's majesty's ship at his coming forth of Denmark had a contrary wind to the rest of his ships, then being in his company, which thing was most strange and true, as the king's majesty acknowledge it, for when the rest of the ships had a fair and good wind, then was the wind contrary and altogether against his majesty. And further the said witch declared, that his majesty had newer come safely from the sea, if his faith had not preuled about their intentions. More were the said witches being demanded how the deil would see them when he was in their company, they confessed that when the deil did receive them for his serowance, and that they had vowed themselves vnto him, then he would carnally see them, albeit to their little pleasure, in respect of his cold nature, and would do the like at sundry other times. As touching the aforesaid Dr. Fian, alias Ion Cunningham, the examination of his acts since his apprehension, declareth the great subtlety of the deil, and therefore maketh things to appear the more miraculous. For being apprehended by the accusation of the said Jailes Duncan aforesaid, who confessed he was their regester, and that there was not one man suffered to come to the deil's readings, but only he. The said doctor was taken and imprisoned, and V said with the accustomed pain, provided for those offences, inflicted V upon the rest as is aforesaid. First, by throwing of his head with a rope, whereat he would confess nothing. Secondly, he was persuaded by fair means to confess his follies, but that would prevail as little. Lastly, he was put to the most sure and cruel pain in the world, called the boots, who after he had received 3 strokes, being inquired if he would confess his damnable acts and wicked life, his tongue would not sarrow him to speak, in respect whereof the rest of the witches willed to search his tongue. Viender, which was found 2 pins thrust VP into the head, whereupon the witches did lay, now is the charm stinted, and showed that those charmed pins were the cause he could not confess anything. Then was he immediately released of the boots, brought before the king, his confession was taken, and his own hand willingly set their VNTO, which contained as followeth. First, that at the general meetings of those witches, he was always present, that he was clerk to all those that were in subjection to the deal Sarois, bearing the name of witches, that alway he did take their oaths for their true Sarois to the deal, and that he wrought for them such matters as the deal still pleased to command him. Item, he confessed that by his witchcraft he did bewitch a gentleman dwelling near to the salt pans, where the said doctor kept school, only for being enamored of a gentlewoman whom he allowed himself, by means of which his sorcery, witchcraft, and dealish practices, he caused the said gentleman that once in exige. Hours he fell into a lunacy and madness, and so continued 1 whole hour together, and for the verity of the same, he caused the gentleman to be brought before the king's majesty, which was vpon the exige. Day of December last, and being in his majesty's chamber, suddenly he got a great scritch and fell into a madness, sometime bending himself, and sometime capering so directly VP, that his head did touch the ceiling of the chamber, to the great admiration of his majesty and others then present, so that all the gentlemen in the chamber were not able to hold him, until they called in more help, who together bound him hand and foot. And suffering the said gentleman to lie still until his fury were past, he within an hour came agging to himself, when being demanded of the king's majesty what he saw or did all that while, answered that he had been in a sound sleep. Item, the said doctor did also confess that he had said means sundry times to obtain his purpose and wicked intent of the same gentlewoman, and seeing himself disappointed of his intention, he determined by all ways he might to obtain the same, trusting by conniving, witchcraft, and sorcery to obtain it in this manner. It happened this gentlewoman being married, had a brother who went to school with the said doctor, and calling his scholar to him, demanded if he did lie with his sister, who answered he did, by means whereof he thought to obtain his purpose, and therefore secretly promised to teach him without stripes, so he would obtain for him 3 hairs of his sister's prejudities, at such time as he should spy best occasion for it. Which the youth promised faithfully to perform, and vowed speedily to put it in practice, taking a piece of connered paper of his maester to lap them in when he had gotten them. And thereupon the boy practiced nightly to obtain his maester's purpose, especially when his sister was asleep. But God, who knoweth the secrets of all hearts, and ruleth all wicked and ungodly practices, would not suffer the intents of this dealish doctor to come to that purpose which he supposed it would, and therefore to declare that he was wholly offended with his wicked intent, did so work by the gentlewoman's own means, that in the end the same was discovered and brought to light. For she being one night asleep, and her brother in bed with her, suddenly cried out to her mother, declaring that her brother would not suffer her to sleep, whereupon her mother, holding a quick capacity, did vehemently suspect Dr. Fian's intention. By reason she was a witch of herself, and therefore presently arose, and was very inquisitive of the boy to understand his intent, and the better to know the same, did beat him with sundry stripes, whereby he discovered the truth vnto her. The mother, therefore, being well practiced in witchcraft, did think it most convenient to meet with the doctor in his own art, and thereupon took the paper from the boy, wherein he should ha put the same hairs, and went to a young heifer which newer had borne calf nor gone to the bull, and with a pair of shears clipped off 3 hairs from the deeder of the cow, and wrapped them in the same paper, which she agging de leeward to the boy, then willing him to giu the same to his said maester, which he immediately did. The schoolmaster, so soon as he had received them, thinking them indeed to be the maid's hairs, went straight and wrought his art upon them. But the doctor had no sooner done his intent to them, but presently the heifer or cow whose hairs they were indeed, came vnto the door of the church wherein the schoolmaster was, into the which the heifer went, and made towards the schoolmaster, leaping and dancing upon him, and following him forth of the church, and to what place soever he went, to the great admiration of all the town's men of salt pans, and many other who did behold the same. The report whereof made all men imagine that he did work it by the deal, without whom it could newer ha been so sufficiently affected. And thereupon the name of the said Dr. Fian, who was but a very young man, began to grow so common among the people of Scotland, that he was secretly nominated for a notable cuneiura. All which although in the beginning he denied, and would not confess, yet having felt the pain of the boots, and the charm stinted, as aforesaid, he confessed all the aforesaid to be most true, without producing any witnesses to eastify the same, and thereupon before the king's majesty he subscribed the said confessions with his own hand, which for truth remaineth upon record in Scotland. After that the depositions and examinations of the said Dr. Fian alias Cunningham was taken, as already is declared, with his own hand willingly set thereunto, he was by the master of the prison committed to ward, and appointed to a chamber by himself, where forsaking his wicked ways, acknowledging his most ungodly life, showing that he had too much followed the allurements and enticements of Sathan, and fondly practiced his conclusions by conjuring, witchcraft, enchantment, sorcery, and such like. He renounced the duel and all his wicked works, vowed to lead the life of a Christian, and seemed newly connected towards God. The morrow after upon conference had with him, he granted that the duel had appeared vnto him in the night before, apparelled all in blacky, with a white wand in his hand, and that the duel demanded of him if he would continue his faithful service, according to his first oath and promise made to that effect. Whom, as he then said, he turly renounced to his face, and said vnto him in this manner, Odd Satan, odd, for I ha listened too much vnto thee, and by the same thou hast vndone me, in respect whereof I turly forsake thee. To whom the duel answered, that once ere thou die thou shall be mine. And with that, as he said, the duel brake the white wand, and immediately vanished forth of his sight. Thus all the day this Dr. Fian continued very solitary, and seemed to ha care of his own soul, and would call upon God, showing himself penitent for his wicked life, nevertheless the same night he found such means, that he stole the key of the prison door and chamber in the which he was, which in the night he opened and fled away to the salt pans, where he was always resident, and first apprehended. Of whose sodden departure when the king's majesty had intelligence, he presently commanded diligent inquiry to be made for his apprehension, and for the better effecting thereof, he sent public proclamations into all parts of his land to the same effect. By means of whose hot and hard pursuit, he was again taken and brought to prison, and then being called before the king's hinds, he was re-examined as well touching his departure, as also touching all that had before happened. But this doctor, notwithstanding that his own confession appeareth remaining in record, viender his own hand writing, and the same thereunto fixed in the presence of the king's majesty and sundry of his council, yet did he turly deny the same. Whereupon the king's majesty, perceiving his stubborn willfulness, concerned and imagined that in the time of his absence he had entered into new conference and league with the duel his master, and that he had been again newly marked, for the which he was narrowly searched, but it could not in any wise be found, yet for more trial of him to make him confess, he was commanded to ha a most strange torment, which was done in this manner following. His nails upon all his fingers were reuen, and pulled off with an instrument called in Scottish a turkis, which in England we call a pair of pincers, and viender ewery nail, there was thrust in 2 needles our ewen up to the heads. At all which torments notwithstanding the doctor newer shrunk any whit, neither would he then confess it the sooner for all the tortures inflicted upon him. Then was he with all conunient speed, by commandment, canoed again to the torment of the boots, wherein he continued a long time, and did abide so many blows in them, that his legs were crushed and beaten together as small as might be, and the bones and flesh so bruised, that the blood and marrow spouted forth in great abundance, whereby they were made unserviceable for ewer. And notwithstanding all these grievous pains and cruel torments, he would not confess anything. So deeply had the duel entered into his heart, that he vehemently denied all that which he had before ouched, and would assay nothing thereunto but this, that what he had done and said before was only done and said for fear of pains which he had endured. Upon great consideration therefore taken by the king's majesty and his council, as well for the due execution of justice vp upon such detestable malefactors, as also for example's sake, to remain a terror to all others hereafter, that shall attempt to deal in the like wicked and ungodly actions, as witchcraft, sorcery, cuneration, and such like. The said Dr. Fian was soon after arraigned, condemned, and adjudged by the law to die, and then to be burned according to the law of that land. Provided in that behalf, whereupon he was put into a cart, and being first strangled, he was immediately put into a great fire, being ready provided for that purpose, and there burned in the castle hill of Edinburgh on a Saturday in the end of January last past, 1591. The rest of the witches which are not yet executed remain in prison till farther trial and knowledge of his majesty's pleasure. This strange discourse before recited may perhaps give you some occasion of doubt to such as shall happen to read the same, and thereby conjecture that the king's majesty would not hazard himself in the presence of such notorious witches, lest there be might ha ensued great danger to his person and the general state of the land, which thing in truth might well ha been feared. But to answer generally to such, let this suffice, that first it is well known that the king is the child and servant of God, and they but servants to the duel. He is the Lord's anointed, and they but vessels of God's wrath. He is a true Christian, and trusteth in God, they worse than infidels, for they only trust in the duel, who daily serve them, till he ha brought them to veter destruction. But hereby it seemeth that his highness carded a magnanimous and undaunted mind, not feared with their enchantments, but resolute in this, that so long as God is with him, he feareth not who is against him. And truly the whole scope of this treatise doth so plainly lay open the wonderful prudence of the Almighty, that if he had not been defended by his omnipotency and power, his hinds had newer returned aliu in his voyage fro Denmark, so that there is no dolt but God woulda as well defend him on the land as on the sea, where they pretended their damnable practice.